Charlotte Woodrow had never seen so much sky. It stretched above her in a great blue bowl, endless and indifferent, with clouds drifting across it like white sails on an ocean. Back in Boston, the sky had belonged in narrow strips between rooftops and church steeples. Here, in Montana territory, it seemed to belong to no one at all. Charlotte sat stiffly on the stagecoach bench, one gloved hand gripping the leather strap beside her, the other pressed firmly over the small reticule in her lap. Dust clung to the hem of her traveling dress. It had settled into the seams of her gloves, gathered along the buttons of her bodice, and powdered the toes of her boots until they were no longer black but a defeated shade of brown. She had told herself she would arrive composed. She had imagined stepping down from the stagecoach with quiet dignity, thanking the driver, and presenting herself at the school board office as Miss Charlotte Woodrow, newly appointed teacher of Bitter Creek School. Instead, after 4 days of rattling roads, questionable meals, little sleep, and one terrifying river crossing, she felt less like a teacher and more like laundry beaten against stone. The stagecoach lurched violently. Charlotte gasped and caught herself before she collided with the large man beside her, who had been sleeping with his hat over his face for the past hour. "Roads improving," he muttered from beneath the brim. Charlotte stared at him. If this was improvement, she prayed she would never know decline. The driver shouted something unintelligible from above. The horses snorted, the stagecoach rounded a bend, and suddenly the town of Bitter Creek appeared below them. Charlotte leaned forward despite herself. It was smaller than she expected. Rougher, too. A scatter of wooden buildings lined a wide, dusty main street. A general store, a blacksmith, a feed stable, a church with a modest white steeple, a jail, 2 saloons, which seemed excessive for a town that looked barely large enough to justify one. Beyond the town rose open range, golden and green, rolling toward distant mountains still capped in snow though it was late spring. Cottonwoods gathered along a winding creek, cattle grazed in the distance, their dark shapes moving lazily beneath the sun. There was beauty here, wild, unsettling beauty. Charlotte swallowed. "Well," said the man beside her, lifting his hat at last and peering out. "There she is, Bitter Creek. God help you if you're staying." Charlotte's stomach tightened. "I am," she said. The man looked at her properly for the first time. His gaze traveled over her neat hat, her buttoned collar, her carefully pinned hair, and the book she had kept beside her the entire journey. Then he gave a short laugh. "You're the new school marm." Charlotte straightened. "I am the new teacher, yes." "That's what I said." Charlotte decided at once that silence was the more dignified response. The stagecoach rolled into town with a great cracking of wheels and jangling of harness. Several men outside the saloon looked up. A dog barked. Somewhere, a woman called after a child. A pig trotted across the road with the calm authority of a mayor. Charlotte watched the pig pass in front of the stagecoach. No one seemed concerned. The coach came to a jarring halt in front of the general store. Charlotte's teeth clicked together. "Bitter Creek!" the driver shouted, as though there might be some confusion. The sleeping passengers stirred. The large man climbed down first. A mother with 2 children followed. Then Charlotte stood carefully, smoothing her skirt with trembling fingers. This was it. A new life. A respectable position. A chance to become someone other than the quiet daughter of a dead minister and the almost wife of a man who had decided, with polite regret, that she lacked warmth. Charlotte lifted her chin. She stepped down from the coach and immediately sank ankle-deep into mud. Her eyes widened. The street, which had appeared dusty from a distance, was in fact a clever trap of dried topsoil over wet muck. Her boot disappeared with a soft, humiliating sound. A child laughed. Charlotte's cheeks burned. She tried to pull her foot free. The mud held fast. "Careful there, miss," called the stage driver, not moving to help. "Street's got a mind of its own after rain." Charlotte tugged again. Her foot came loose so suddenly she staggered backward and nearly sat down in the filth. A hand caught her elbow. Strong, warm, steady. Charlotte looked up. The man holding her was tall, broad-shouldered, and dusty from hat brim to boot heel. His dark blonde hair curled slightly where it escaped beneath a worn black hat. His jaw was unshaven, his shirt open at the throat, and his smile was the sort Charlotte's mother would have called dangerous before crossing the street to avoid it. He looked amused, not cruelly amused. Worse, charmingly amused. "You'll want to make peace with the mud early," he said. "It wins most arguments." Charlotte drew herself upright and gently removed her arm from his hand. "Thank you," she said, coolly. His smile deepened. "You're welcome." The driver began unloading luggage from the top of the coach. Charlotte turned just in time to see her trunk slip from his grasp. "My trunk!" she cried. It fell with a heavy thud directly into the mud, landing on one corner before tipping onto its side. The latch sprang open. A horrifying spill of neatly folded garments, books, stockings, and one very private nightdress began sliding into the street. Charlotte froze. The child laughed harder. The tall stranger moved at once. He stepped into the mud as though born from it, reached down, and began gathering her belongings with surprising care. Charlotte hurried forward, mortified. "Please don't. That is, I can manage." "Oh, gracious." He picked up a book, wiped the cover lightly against his sleeve, and read the title. "Essays of Ralph Waldo Emerson," he said. "Any relation?" Charlotte snatched it from him. "No. Shame. I thought we might be cousins." She looked at him sharply. "Your name is Emerson?" "Wyatt Emerson." He said it as though it should mean something. Judging by the sudden interest of two women standing near the general store window, it did. Charlotte bent to retrieve her gloves from the mud. "Miss Charlotte Woodrow, Miss Woodrow," he repeated. The way he said it made her feel as if her name had been taken outside and shown the sunset. She did not care for that. At least, she told herself she did not. Wyatt lifted her trunk as though it weighed nothing and set it upright on the boardwalk. Then he gathered the last of her fallen things and placed them inside, pausing only when he picked up the nightdress. Charlotte gasped and reached for it. He handed it over with exaggerated solemnity, though his eyes betrayed laughter. "Ma'am." Her face went hot enough to melt wax. "Thank you," she said again, this time with less grace. "You say that like it pains you." "It does not pain me to express gratitude." "Could have fooled me." Charlotte shut the trunk with more force than necessary. Wyatt leaned one shoulder against the post outside the general store and studied her with open curiosity. "You staying in Bitter Creek?" "I am." "For long?" "I have accepted the teaching position." His brows rose. "You're the new school teacher?" "Yes." "Well, that explains the way you're looking at everything." "How am I looking at everything?" "Like the whole town tracked mud across your best rug." Charlotte pressed her lips together. It was unfortunately accurate. "I am simply observing my surroundings." "Sure you are." A gust of wind lifted dust from the street. Somewhere nearby, a man shouted, followed by a crash from inside one of the saloons. Charlotte flinched. Wyatt did not even look over. The saloon doors burst open, and two men stumbled out, shoving each other. One fell into a water trough. The other laughed so hard he had to lean against the hitching rail. Charlotte stared. Wyatt followed her gaze. "That's nothing. Last week Harlan Pike rode a mule straight through Miller's Mercantile." "Why?" "Lost a bet." Charlotte turned back to Wyatt, horrified. "And this is considered acceptable behavior?" "No, but it was considered memorable." She could not stop herself from saying, "This town is uncivilized." His grin flickered. For one brief second, Charlotte thought she had offended him. Then the amusement returned, brighter than before. "Probably," he said, "but it grows on you." "I find that unlikely." "Most good things are." Charlotte had no answer for that. The general store door opened, and a plump woman in a blue dress hurried out, wiping her hands on her apron. "You must be Miss Woodrow." Charlotte turned with relief. "Yes, I'm Mrs. Abigail Mercer. My husband sits on the school board. We've been expecting you." "Mrs." Mercer's warm smile faltered when she noticed the mud on Charlotte's skirt, the open trunk, and Wyatt Emerson standing far too close. "Oh dear. I had a small mishap," Charlotte said. Wyatt tipped his hat. town introduced itself. Mrs. Mercer narrowed her eyes at him. Wyatt Emerson, don't you have somewhere else to be? Several places. Then pick one. He laughed softly and pushed away from the post. Charlotte looked between them. There was familiarity there. Exasperation too, but not fear. Interesting. Wyatt lifted Charlotte's trunk again. Where do you want this, Mrs. Mercer? We have a room ready for Miss Woodrow at the boarding house. I'll carry it. That will not be necessary, Charlotte said quickly. Wyatt looked at her. Probably not. Then he carried it anyway. Charlotte watched him walk ahead, boots sure in the mud, shoulders broad beneath his worn coat. Several people greeted him as he passed. A boy ran up to show him something carved from wood. Wyatt paused, admired it seriously, ruffled the boy's hair, and continued on. For a notorious troublemaker, he seemed oddly well-liked. Mrs. Mercer leaned closer to Charlotte. You'll want to be careful with that one. Charlotte stiffened. Mr. Emerson? Mrs. Mercer sighed, though Charlotte noticed her mouth twitch as though fighting a smile. He's not wicked, exactly, but he is wild, acts first, thinks later, and leaves everyone else holding their breath. There isn't a saloon fight, horse race, broken fence, or foolish dare in this town that hasn't had his name attached to it at one time or another. Charlotte looked ahead. Wyatt had stopped to help an elderly man lift a crate onto a wagon, and yet everyone seems to know him. Oh, everyone knows Wyatt. Mrs. Mercer's voice lowered. Especially the young ladies. Charlotte looked away at once. I see. Mrs. Mercer patted her arm. You're a proper girl. You'll do just fine here. Just don't let him charm you. Charlotte gave a small, composed smile. I assure you, Mrs. Mercer, I am not easily charmed. Ahead of them, Wyatt turned as though he had heard. His eyes met Charlotte's across the muddy street. He smiled. Charlotte's heart gave one sudden, ridiculous leap. She immediately looked down. No, absolutely not. She had come to Montana to teach children, not to lose her senses over a dusty cowboy with a reckless grin and no respect for propriety. By the time they reached the boarding house, Charlotte had recovered herself. Mostly. The house belonged to Mrs. Bell, a widow with sharp eyes and a kinder voice than her expression suggested. She showed Charlotte to a small room at the top of the stairs with a narrow bed, a washstand, a braided rug, and a window overlooking the distant creek. Wyatt set the trunk at the foot of the bed. Charlotte stood near the door, uncertain whether to thank him a third time. He looked around the room. Not much, but the roof only leaks on one side. Mrs. Bell, from the hallway, snapped, It does no such thing. Wyatt winked at Charlotte. Only during rain, then. Charlotte fought not to smile. She failed slightly. Unfortunately, he saw it. There it is, he said. There what is? I was starting to wonder if you knew how. Charlotte's smile vanished. How to what? Smile. Her spine straightened. I smile when something is amusing. Then I'll have to work harder. That will not be necessary. You keep saying that, and yet you keep ignoring it. His grin softened into something less teasing. For a moment, he simply looked at her, not as the men on the street had looked, not boldly or rudely, more as though he was trying to read a line in a book written in careful script. Charlotte felt suddenly exposed. Then Mrs. Bell called from below that supper would be at 6, and the moment broke. Wyatt touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Welcome to Bitter Creek, Miss Woodrow. Good day, Mr. Emerson. He started for the hall, then paused. One piece of advice. I have received a great deal of advice today. This one's useful. She folded her hands. Very well. If you're going to survive this town, don't trust the mud, don't trust the weather, and don't trust anything Harlan Pike says after noon. Despite herself, Charlotte asked, Why after noon? That's when he starts drinking. And before noon? Wyatt considered. Still questionable. This time, Charlotte truly did smile. Wyatt looked pleased enough to be insufferable. Then he left. Charlotte stood alone in the little room, listening to his boots descend the stairs. When the front door closed below, she released a breath she had not realized she was holding. She crossed to the window. From there, she could see the town spread below her. Bitter Creek looked raw and noisy and impossible. Horses stamped near hitching posts. Men crossed the street with rifles at their side. Women carried baskets and called greeting. Children ran barefoot through the dust. And there, stepping into the street as though it belonged to him, was Wyatt Emerson. A young woman outside the dressmaker's shop waved at him with obvious delight. Another, passing with a basket, slowed just enough to be noticed. Wyatt tipped his hat to both, easy and careless. Charlotte's mouth tightened. So, that was how it was. Well, it did not concern her, not in the slightest. She turned away from the window and opened her trunk, beginning the dismal task of rescuing her belongings from dried mud. Her books could be saved. 2 blouses would need washing. Her nightdress, she paused, cheeks warming again. Mr. Wyatt Emerson had held her nightdress in the middle of the street. Charlotte closed her eyes. Montana, she decided, was determined to ruin her. That evening, after supper, Charlotte sat at the small desk in her room and wrote a letter to her aunt in Boston. Dear Aunt Margaret, I have arrived safely in Bitter Creek. The town is quite small and somewhat rough, but the people appear generally kind. The schoolhouse is to be shown to me tomorrow. I believe I shall be useful here. She paused, tapping the pen lightly against the page. Then she added, the country is very wide, wider than I imagined. She considered writing about the mud, the saloon fight, the pig, the fallen trunk, and the cowboy with laughing eye. She did not. Instead, she wrote, I am determined to conduct myself with dignity and to make a proper place for myself here. Outside, somewhere in town, music drifted from a saloon. A fiddle, quick and lively. Men laughed. A horse whinnied. The wind moved softly through the cottonwoods near the creek. Charlotte set down her pen and went to the window once more. Lanterns glowed along the street. Montana dusk had turned the mountains purple. The sky burned orange at the horizon, fading into deep blue overhead. It was beautiful, lonely, but beautiful. Then, below, Wyatt Emerson stepped out of the general store carrying a sack over one shoulder. He handed it to an old woman waiting beside a wagon, helped her climb onto the seat, then stood talking with her until she laughed. Charlotte watched, despite every sensible part of herself advising otherwise. He was trouble. Everyone said so. And Charlotte Woodrow had always been an obedient woman, a careful woman, a proper woman. But as Wyatt glanced up toward the boarding house window, as though he had felt her watching, Charlotte stepped back quickly into the shadows. Her heart was beating too fast, far too fast. She pressed one hand to her chest and scolded herself in silence. Tomorrow she would begin her work. Tomorrow she would meet her students. Tomorrow she would become the respectable teacher Bitter Creek expected, and Wyatt Emerson would be nothing more than an unfortunate first impression. Outside, his laughter rose faintly on the evening air. Charlotte shut the curtain. Then, after a moment, she opened it just a crack. Charlotte Woodrow's first morning in Bitter Creek began with chicken. Not the pleasant sort one might imagine pecking peacefully in a farmyard somewhere beyond town. These chickens were directly beneath her window, and apparently engaged in some kind of bitter personal dispute that began before sunrise. Charlotte opened her eyes to furious clucking and stared at the ceiling in disbelief. Then came a rooster, KK, a truly unreasonable rooster. Its crow split the dawn with such determination that Charlotte sat upright in bed, one hand clutching the blanket to her chest. For one disoriented moment, she forgot where she was. Then she saw the unfamiliar washstand, the little braided rug, the pale Montana light creeping around the curtains, and memory returned all at once. Bitter Creek, Montana territory, mud, Wyatt Emerson. Charlotte immediately frowned at herself. There was no reason whatsoever that the man should enter her thoughts before breakfast. She climbed from bed and crossed to the window. Morning sunlight poured across the town in soft gold. The mountains beyond looked almost painted, their snowcaps glowing faintly beneath the pale sky. And there, directly below, stood Wyatt Emerson. Charlotte froze. He leaned against the hitching rail outside the boarding house, speaking to an older rancher while absently stroking the nose of a chestnut horse. His hat sat low over his brow. He laughed at something the rancher said, and Charlotte discovered, rather annoyingly, that even from a second-story window she could recognize that laugh. Warm, easy, careless, dangerous. As though sensing her gaze, Wyatt glanced upward. Charlotte darted behind the curtain so quickly she nearly tangled herself in it. Her heart thumped. This was absurd, entirely absurd. She was a grown woman, not a schoolgirl hiding from a boy. Carefully, she peeked out again. Wyatt was still looking toward the window. Worse, he appeared amused. Charlotte dropped the curtain at once. "No," she informed herself firmly. "We shall not begin this way." Unfortunately, Montana seemed determined not to consult her preferences. The schoolhouse sat on a gentle rise at the edge of town, overlooking the creek and the sprawling valley beyond. It was a simple white building with a bell tower, 2 narrow windows, and a weathered porch that creaked alarmingly beneath Charlotte's feet. Mrs. Mercer had accompanied her there after breakfast. "It's not fancy," she said apologetically as they approached, "but the children are good-hearted." Charlotte suspected that phrase often preceded disaster. Inside, the schoolhouse smelled faintly of chalk, dust, pine wood, and smoke from the pot-bellied stove. Rows of wooden desks filled the room. A blackboard stood at the front beside a map of the United States that curled at the corner. Charlotte slowly turned in place. It was small, worn, imperfect, and somehow lovely. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floorboards. Wildflowers sat in a jar near the windowsill, likely left by the previous teacher. Something softened inside her chest. "This will do very nicely," she said quietly. Mrs. Mercer smiled. "I thought you might say that." Charlotte set her books upon the desk and ran her fingers lightly across the scratched wood. Generations of restless children had carved initials into it. E.H., T.M., W.E. Charlotte paused at the last set of initials. "Wyatt Emerson attended school here?" she asked. Mrs. Mercer snorted. "Very briefly." Charlotte tried not to smile. "Was he terribly troublesome?" Oh heavens, yes. Charlotte should not have enjoyed hearing that as much as she did. The children arrived in a thunderstorm of noise. Charlotte had expected perhaps a dozen quiet pupils carrying slates neatly beneath their arm. Instead, 23 children exploded through the door like invading cavalry. Boots thundered. Voices overlapped. Someone tracked mud across the floor within seconds. A red-haired boy ran directly into a desk. 2 girls argued loudly over a ribbon. One child brought a frog. Charlotte stood motionless at the front of the room while chaos swirled around her. A small blonde girl looked up at her and asked, "Are you real?" Charlotte blinked. "I beg your pardon? You look too fancy to be real." Before Charlotte could answer, another child shouted, "Tommy put a snake in Abigail's lunch pail." Pandemonium erupted. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Boston had not prepared her for this. "Children," she said. No one heard her. "Children." Still nothing. A boy near the back had somehow climbed halfway onto a desk. Charlotte straightened her spine. "Children." The room went silent. Every face turned toward her. Charlotte startled herself almost as much as the student. She cleared her throat and attempted dignity. "Good morning. I am Miss Woodrow, and I shall be your teacher." The children stared. One little boy raised his hand solemnly. "Yes?" Charlotte asked. "You talk funny." A wave of giggles spread through the room. Charlotte inhaled slowly. "It is called proper pronunciation." The same boy considered this carefully. "Sounds exhausting." More laughter. Charlotte pressed her lips together to stop herself from smiling. Perhaps these children were not impossible after all. By midday, however, she reconsidered. 2 ink spills. 1 fistfight. 3 separate arguments over pencils. 1 child crying because another child had informed her babies came from cabbages. Charlotte removed her spectacles and rubbed her temples. Meanwhile, the frog had escaped. She was crouched beneath a desk, attempting to retrieve it when the schoolhouse door opened. Heavy boots crossed the floorboard. Charlotte looked up. Wyatt Emerson stood in the doorway carrying an armful of firewood despite the perfectly pleasant weather. Several children cheered. "Uncle Wyatt!" Charlotte blinked. 2 little girls hurried toward him at once. One with dark braids, the other missing a front tooth. Wyatt balanced the wood in one arm while the girls clung to him happily. "These are your nieces?" Charlotte asked before she could stop herself. Unfortunately, Wyatt said gravely. The older girl gasped. You said we were your favorites. You are my favorites. That doesn't mean you aren't troublesome. Charlotte discovered she liked the sound of him with children. That realization felt unsafe. Wyatt carried the wood to the stove and stacked it neatly. Charlotte rose from beneath the desk, holding the frog carefully in both hands. Wyatt looked at her, then at the frog, then back at her. His mouth twitched. Charlotte immediately became defensive. This animal was disrupting lessons. I'm sure he feels terrible about it. Several children snorted with laughter. Charlotte set the frog into a jar with perhaps more force than necessary. Why are you here, Mr. Emerson? Wyatt looked thoughtful. Brought wood. In May. Preparedness is important. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. He grinned. The terrible thing was that she was beginning to recognize when he was teasing her. Worse still, she was beginning to enjoy it. Wyatt leaned casually against the wall near the door while Charlotte resumed lessons. The children became suspiciously attentive with him watching. Charlotte attempted arithmetic. Now then, she said, writing on the blackboard. If a rancher has 12 cattle and sells 4, depends which rancher, Wyatt interrupted. Charlotte turned slowly. Excuse me? Well, Harlan Pike can't count past 8 if he's been drinking. The children burst into laughter. Charlotte fought to maintain composure. Mr. Emerson. Yes, ma'am? If you intend to remain in this classroom, you will refrain from interrupting instruction. His eyes gleamed. Yes, ma'am. The way he said it did not sound remotely obedient. Later that afternoon, Charlotte dismissed the children at last. The room emptied in a storm of chatter and flying boots. Wyatt's nieces waved enthusiastically as they left. Bye, Miss Woodrow. Don't let Uncle Wyatt bother you too much. Charlotte looked sharply toward Wyatt. He appeared deeply wounded. I'm beloved. By whom? Mostly myself. Charlotte failed to hide a laugh. The sound escaped before she could stop it. Wyatt went still. Charlotte realized too late that he was looking at her with startling intensity. Not teasing now, not careless, simply pleased. The air between them shifted strangely. Charlotte became aware of everything all at once. The sunlight slanting through the windows, dust floating in golden beams, the faint scent of leather and pine from Wyatt's coat, the sudden quickness of her pulse. Dangerous, she thought again. Very dangerous. She turned away quickly and gathered papers from her desk. You needn't linger, Mr. Emerson. I know. Then why are you? A pause. Then, softly, wanted to see how your first day went. Charlotte looked up despite herself. Something unexpectedly sincere lived beneath the humor in his face. And that was far more unsettling than flirtation. It was, Charlotte hesitated, louder than anticipated. Wyatt laughed quietly. You'll survive. I'm not entirely convinced. You handled yourself fine. Charlotte set down the papers. You observed enough to determine that. Long enough. And how long was that? Since about the frog incident. Charlotte stared. You were standing outside the schoolhouse watching me wrestle with a frog. It was getting interesting. Her cheeks warmed. You are impossible. That's what everybody says. Charlotte shook her head and returned to sorting paper. Then she noticed Wyatt moving toward one of the desks near the window. He crouched beside it and began tightening a loose leg with a pocket knife and what appeared to be alarming familiarity. Charlotte frowned. What are you doing? Desk was wobbling. You notice that? Kid in the second row nearly tipped over twice. Charlotte watched him for a moment. His large hands worked carefully and efficiently. Not clumsy at all. Not reckless. Just capable. Unexpectedly gentle. You repair school furniture often? She asked. Not officially. You simply wander into buildings fixing things? When needed. Charlotte folded her arms. And who determines whether you're needed? Wyatt looked up. Usually me. She should not have smiled at that. Unfortunately, she did. Wyatt's expression softened again in that dangerous way. There it is, he murmured. Charlotte instantly became suspicious. What? That smile. Her stomach performed a deeply irritating flutter. It is merely politeness. Sure it is. Charlotte busied herself with her book. Outside, the late afternoon sun turned the valley gold. Children's voices echoed faintly from town. Somewhere near the creek, someone played a fiddle. Wyatt stood and tested the repaired desk. Solid now. He nodded with satisfaction. There. Charlotte glanced at it. Thank you. You're getting better at saying that. I have always been perfectly capable of gratitude. Not to me. She opened her mouth to argue. Unfortunately, she could not think of a convincing response. Wyatt moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, nearly forgot. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped carefully in cloth. Charlotte stared as he placed it gently atop her desk. What is that? Peace offering. Cautiously, she unwrapped the cloth. Inside sat a tiny carved wooden bird. Simple, smooth, beautifully made. Charlotte looked up in surprise. Wyatt shrugged one shoulder. My nephew made it. Figured your classroom needed something less ugly than arithmetic. Her expression softened before she could stop it. It's lovely. He'll be unbearable when I tell him you said that. Charlotte turned the little bird carefully in her hand. You came all the way here merely to deliver firewood and a wooden bird and inspect your frog situation. Despite herself, she laughed again. This time Wyatt smiled slowly, as though the sound pleased him more than he intended to admit. Then his gaze drifted to the wildflowers near the window. You know, he said casually, most folks around here spend months before they stop looking scared of Montana. Charlotte stiffened slightly. I do not look scared. You look terrified of a chicken this morning. That rooster was aggressive. Wyatt grinned. Fair point. Charlotte shook her head. You seem to find great amusement in my difficulties. Not your difficulties. His voice softened again. Your surprises. She looked at him. For one strange suspended moment, neither spoke. Then footsteps sounded outside, breaking the spell. Wyatt stepped backward toward the door. Well, Miss Woodrow, he drawled, settling his hat onto his head. Try not to let the children burn the place down tomorrow. Charlotte lifted her chin. I shall endeavor to prevent it. Good. He paused again at the doorway. Then, with maddening ease, you smiled 3 times today. That's progress. Before Charlotte could form a reply, he disappeared outside. She stared after him in disbelief, then immediately glanced toward the window. Sure enough, Wyatt looked back once from the schoolyard and tipped his hat. By the end of Charlotte Woodrow's second week in Bitter Creek, she had developed 3 firm conclusions. First, Montana children possessed the collective energy of a stampede. Second, dust entered buildings through methods that defied both logic and architecture. And third, Wyatt Emerson appeared everywhere. Everywhere. If Charlotte walked to the mercantile, Wyatt somehow emerged from the blacksmith's shop. If she visited the church, he was outside repairing a wagon wheel. If she crossed the street carrying books, he materialized beside her offering assistance she did not require, or so she insisted. Unfortunately, her insistence had begun losing strength. Morning, Miss Woodrow. Good morning, Mr. Emerson. You're frowning at that basket like it insulted your family. It is excessively heavy. Then suddenly he would be carrying it. Charlotte had discovered this was simply how Wyatt Emerson behaved. He inserted himself into situations with complete confidence that his presence belonged there, and somehow, infuriatingly, people allowed it. The widows adored him. Children followed him through town like duckling. Old ranchers slapped him on the back and called him reckless while secretly smiling when they said it. Even Mrs. Bell, who claimed Wyatt was nothing but trouble wrapped in charm, saved him extra pie. Charlotte found this deeply suspicious. She also found herself watching for him. That realization arrived one afternoon with horrifying clarity while she stood at the schoolhouse window pretending to organize books. In truth, she had noticed Wyatt ride past 30 seconds earlier. Charlotte immediately closed the curtain on herself. No, she whispered aloud. This would not do. She was a teacher, a respectable woman, entirely too sensible to become distracted by a man with sun-browned hands and a grin capable of toppling civilization. And yet, when he smiled at her, something warm and reckless unfurled quietly inside her chest. It was becoming a problem. That Friday evening, Mrs. Mercer convinced Charlotte to attend the town social at the church hall. You cannot spend every evening alone correcting arithmetic, Mrs. Mercer declared firmly while helping pin Charlotte's hair. People will think you dislike them. I hardly know anyone. That is precisely why you must come. Charlotte reluctantly agreed. The church social proved louder and far more cheerful than anticipated. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm golden light across the crowded hall. Long tables held pies, biscuits, roasted meats, and enough preserves to survive a siege. Children darted beneath tables. Women chatted in clusters. Men argued amiably about cattle prices. A fiddler played near the far wall while several couples danced. Charlotte lingered near the refreshments, uncertain where to place herself. Then she heard Wyatt's laugh. Naturally, he stood near the doorway surrounded by 3 ranchers and 2 openly admiring young women. One of the women touched his arm while laughing too loudly at something he said. Charlotte looked away at once, absolutely none of her concern. Mrs. Mercer appeared beside her carrying lemonade. "He's looking at you." Charlotte nearly spilled her drink. "Who?" Mrs. Mercer looked delighted. "Oh, don't pretend." Charlotte very carefully adjusted her gloves. "I assure you I have no idea what you mean." Charlotte refused to glance toward Wyatt again. This resolve lasted approximately 14 seconds. He was, in fact, looking directly at her. Worse, when their eyes met, his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The careless charm softened into something warmer, more focused. As though the crowded room had narrowed briefly to only the 2 of them. Charlotte's stomach fluttered traitorously. Then one of the young women beside Wyatt whispered something in his ear. Charlotte immediately turned away. How absurd! Why should she care whether women flirted with Wyatt Emerson? The entire town seemed to flirt with Wyatt Emerson. He probably encouraged it. The thought irritated her far more than it should have. Later that evening, Charlotte stepped outside for air. The church hall had grown warm from bodies and lantern smoke. Outside, cool evening winds swept through town carrying the scent of pine, horses, and distant rain. Charlotte breathed deeply. Montana night still astonished her. The stars here seemed impossibly large. She walked slowly toward the edge of the churchyard, enjoying the quiet. Then shouting erupted down the street. Charlotte startled. A crash followed. Men's voices rose sharply near the saloon. Several people spilled out onto the boardwalk to see what was happening. Charlotte hesitated. Then, against better judgment, she moved closer. The saloon doors burst open. 2 men stumbled violently into the street. One was Wyatt Emerson. Charlotte's heart dropped. Wyatt shoved the other man backward hard enough to send him sprawling into the mud. The crowd erupted in noise. The other man lurched upright, swearing viciously. "You think you're better than everybody," he shouted drunkenly. Wyatt looked furious. Not playful, furious. Truly angry. "I told you to keep your mouth shut," Wyatt snapped. The drunk swung wildly. Wyatt dodged the punch and struck him once across the jaw. The man collapsed immediately. Charlotte stared in horror. Several men rushed forward. Someone laughed. Someone else shouted for water. Wyatt stood breathing hard in the middle of the street, hat gone, hair disheveled. Then he saw Charlotte. The moment stretched. Embarrassment flickered briefly across his face. Not shame exactly, but awareness. Charlotte's chest tightened unexpectedly. She should leave, she thought. This was precisely what everyone had warned her about. Violence, recklessness, saloon brawls. Wyatt Emerson behaving exactly as advertised. Yet even now, several townsmen were clapping him on the shoulder approvingly. Mrs. Mercer hurried up beside Charlotte with a troubled sigh. "Oh dear." Charlotte kept her eyes fixed on Wyatt. "He struck that man." "Yes." "In the middle of the street." "Yes." Charlotte turned toward her. "And no one appears remotely surprised." Mrs. Mercer hesitated. "Well, there's a bit more to it." Charlotte folded her arms. "The man Wyatt hit is named Curtis Boyle. He's been drinking since noon. He cornered Mrs. Abernathy inside the saloon and started making remarks about her husband dying in debt." Charlotte blinked. Mrs. Abernathy was the widow with 3 children whose youngest daughter attended Charlotte's class. "He insulted a widow? And frightened her boy badly." Mrs. Mercer sighed. "Wyatt warned him twice." Charlotte looked back toward the street. Wyatt now crouched beside the unconscious drunk, apparently checking whether he had broken anything important. A small boy clung to Wyatt's sleeve, crying quietly. Wyatt spoke to him gently enough that Charlotte could not hear the word. Something inside her shifted slightly. Annoyingly, the drunk groaned from the mud. Wyatt immediately stood and hauled him upright before depositing him onto the boardwalk with surprising care for a man he had just punched. "Sleep it off," Wyatt muttered. Then he looked toward Charlotte again. This time she did not look away quickly enough. Their eyes held. Charlotte suddenly became aware of how loud her pulse sounded. Wyatt touched his split knuckle absently and gave her the faintest crooked smile. Charlotte frowned immediately. She was not encouraging him, not remotely. Still, when he crossed the street toward her a few moments later, she remained where she was, which was perhaps its own kind of answer. "You look disappointed," Wyatt said as he approached. Charlotte stared at him. "Should I not be? A little scandalized, maybe." "I am scandalized. Only a little, though." Charlotte tried to maintain indignation. It became difficult while noticing the scrape along his cheekbone. "You are injured." Wyatt touched his face and seemed surprised to find blood there. "Happens." That is not a reassuring response. He smiled faintly. "You were worried. I was observing." Charlotte drew herself up. "Mr. Emerson, violence is not admirable." His expression sobered slightly. "I know." The simple sincerity of it caught her off guard. Wind stirred through the street, lifting loose strands of Charlotte's hair. Music drifted faintly from the church hall behind them. Wyatt glanced toward the building. "You heading back inside?" "I was considering returning to the boarding house." "Alone?" "It is hardly far." "Still walking you." "That is unnecessary. You keep using that word, and you continue ignoring it. That's because I'm right." Charlotte should have argued further. Instead, 10 minutes later, she found herself walking beside Wyatt beneath the lantern-lit sky. The town quieted as they moved farther from the church. Boardwalks creaked softly beneath their steps. Somewhere nearby, a piano played from inside the saloon. Charlotte clasped her shawl tighter against the cool wind. Beside her, Wyatt walked with easy confidence, hands tucked loosely into his coat pockets. For a time, neither spoke. Then Wyatt said quietly, "You think less of me now." Charlotte looked at him in surprise. The remark carried no bitterness, just certainty. "That depends," she answered carefully. "On what?" "On whether saloon fights are a regular hobby." He huffed a laugh. "Not lately." "That is not comforting either." "You want the truth?" "Yes." Wyatt glanced ahead toward the dark outline of the boarding house. "Most folks around here expect me to be the bad idea in every room." His tone remained light, but something heavier lived beneath it. After a while, people stop asking questions and just assume. Charlotte studied him. "You dislike that. Doesn't usually bother me. But?" He looked down at her then. "But I don't particularly enjoy you believing it." Charlotte's breath caught slightly. Dangerous. Again that word. Everything about this man felt dangerous in ways she did not entirely understand. Not because he frightened her, because he made her feel strangely alive. The realization unsettled her deeply. They reached the boarding house steps. Charlotte turned toward him. "For what it is worth, I do not think you struck that man without reason." Wyatt's expression softened. "That almost sounded like trust." "It was merely fairness." "Sure it was." Charlotte should have gone inside. Instead, she lingered beneath the lantern glow while wind rustled through the cottonwoods nearby. "You know," Wyatt said after a moment, "when you first got here, you looked miserable every second." Charlotte frowned. "Thank you. You did. I was adjusting." "You still are." She sighed softly. "This place is very different from Boston." "That obvious?" "Yes." He leaned one shoulder against the porch railing. "What do you miss most?" Charlotte hesitated. Then quietly, "Knowing how things work." Wyatt watched her carefully. "In Boston, I understood the rules. I understood who I was supposed to be." She looked out toward the dark street. "Here I constantly feel uncertain." "You're doing all right. I chased a runaway goat through town yesterday." Wyatt bit back a grin. "I heard about that." "Of course you did. Mrs. Bell said you threatened it with literature. It ate 3 pages of my poetry book." "That does sound personal." Charlotte laughed before she could stop herself. The sound faded into the quiet night between them. Wyatt looked at her with that same warm intensity again. Then he said softly, "Maybe the territory's just waiting for you to stop being afraid of it." Charlotte went still. The words settled somewhere deep inside her. Afraid. Was she afraid? Perhaps she was. Afraid of looking foolish. Afraid of failing. Afraid of becoming someone unexpected. Afraid of wanting things she had never allowed herself to want before. Like freedom. Like adventure. Like a man who smiled at her as though he could already see the woman she might become. Charlotte looked up at Wyatt. For one suspended moment, the air seemed charged with something neither of them named. The wind lifted a strand of hair loose from her pins. Wyatt's gaze followed the movement. Charlotte's pulse stumbled. Then Mrs. Bell's voice shattered the moment from an upstairs window. "Miss Woodrow, if that man keeps you out there much longer, people will start planning the wedding." Wyatt barked out a laugh. Charlotte nearly died on the spot. Mrs. Bell slammed the window shut again. Silence followed. Charlotte could not feel her face anymore. Wyatt looked entirely too pleased. "Good night, Miss Woodrow." Charlotte gathered every shred of dignity remaining to her. "Good night, Mr. Emerson." She turned swiftly toward the boarding house door. Then Wyatt called after her, "Charlotte." She stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name. Slowly, she looked back. His expression had gentled completely now. "No goats tomorrow," he said solemnly. Charlotte stared at him. Then, despite herself, she laughed again. And Wyatt Emerson looked at her like he had just won something important. By June, Charlotte Woodrow had stopped jumping every time she heard gunfire. This was progress. Granted, most of the gunfire came from ranchers shooting at rattlesnakes or coyotes rather than one another, but Charlotte still considered her growing composure a significant personal achievement. She had also learned never to leave laundry unattended during high wind, never to trust a horse labeled mostly gentle, and never to ask Wyatt Emerson a simple question unless prepared for an answer that would either irritate or unsettle her, usually both. "You've been in Montana nearly a month now," Wyatt announced one afternoon outside the schoolhouse. "That means it's time." Charlotte looked up from locking the schoolhouse door. "Time for what?" "Horseback riding." "No." Wyatt blinked. "You didn't even consider it." "I considered it immediately and rejected it immediately." He leaned lazily against the porch railing, hat tipped back slightly. "You can't live in Montana forever and refuse to ride." "I have no intention of living in Montana forever." The words came automatically, too automatically, because the moment she said them, something inside her tightened unexpectedly, Wyatt noticed. His expression shifted just slightly. "You don't?" he asked quietly. Charlotte looked away too quickly. I simply mean my position here may not be permanent." She hated when he made that sound. It suggested he knew she was hiding something from herself, which was becoming an increasingly irritating habit of his. Charlotte adjusted the books in her arms. "In any case, horses dislike me. That's because they sense fear. I am not afraid." "Charlotte," she frowned. "I dislike when you say my name in that tone." "What tone?" "The tone that implies you know me better than I know myself." Wyatt grinned slowly. "Maybe I do." Charlotte should not have felt that sentence all the way down to her ribs. Unfortunately, she did. 2 days later, Charlotte found herself sitting atop a horse. This development occurred against her better judgment, her instincts, and possibly her constitutional right. "This is absurd," she informed Wyatt tightly. The horse shifted beneath her. Charlotte immediately grabbed the saddle horn with both hands. Wyatt looked infuriatingly calm beside her own mount. "You're doing fine." "I am perched upon 1,200 pounds of bad decisions. Daisy's old enough to qualify for a pension." The mare lazily chewed something while appearing half asleep. Charlotte remained unconvinced. "How did you persuade me into this?" Wyatt considered. "You called me a coward." "I absolutely did not." "You implied it." "I implied no such thing." "You said civilized people do not require horses to survive." "That is factually correct." "And I said maybe civilized people are boring." Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "And then you accepted the challenge," Wyatt finished smugly. Charlotte hated that he was right. The truly maddening part was that somewhere along the way, she had begun enjoying his challenges. Not because she wished to lose, because around Wyatt Emerson, she kept discovering she was capable of things she had already decided she could not do. It was deeply inconvenient. "Relax your shoulders," Wyatt instructed. "I am relaxed." "Charlotte, you look like a church lady preparing for execution." She glared at him. Wyatt laughed softly. The sound rolled warm and easy through the summer air. They rode slowly through open meadowland outside town, wildflowers swaying in the breeze beneath a sky so blue it hardly looked real. Charlotte tried not to stare too openly at the scenery or at Wyatt. Both were becoming problems. "You're doing better already," Wyatt said after a while. "I am surviving." "That too," Daisy plodded calmly ahead. Gradually, Charlotte loosened her death grip on the saddle. The breeze tugged strands of hair free from her pins. Sunlight warmed her shoulders. Somewhere nearby, water rushed softly over rocks. And to her astonishment, this was pleasant. No, more than pleasant. Freeing. Charlotte laughed suddenly as Daisy stepped carefully through a shallow creek. Wyatt turned immediately toward her. "There she is again." Charlotte looked suspicious. "Who?" "That girl who keeps escaping." She frowned faintly. "What does that mean?" Wyatt shrugged one shoulder. "The real you." Charlotte's chest tightened unexpectedly. The real you. The phrase unsettled her because she did not entirely know whether he was right. Back east, Charlotte had always understood herself through rules. Proper daughters behaved properly. Proper women spoke softly. Proper ladies did not laugh too loudly or climb trees or race horses or flirt with reckless cowboys beneath enormous Montana skies. And yet lately, she laughed more, spoke more, felt more. Sometimes it seemed as though the quiet woman she had spent years becoming was slowly cracking open beneath all this sunlight and wind and impossible western space. And Wyatt Emerson stood directly at the center of it. Dangerous indeed. Over the following weeks, Wyatt continued introducing Charlotte to Montana as though personally determined to wrestle her into loving it. He took her fishing despite her insistence that fish smelled terrible. "You're holding the pole wrong." "I am holding it exactly as instructed." "You're holding it like it insulted your family." Charlotte frowned at the river. 5 minutes later, she caught a trout entirely by accident. Wyatt looked scandalized. "You didn't even bait properly." Charlotte tried and failed to hide her delight. "I appear naturally gifted." "You absolutely are not." She laughed so hard she nearly dropped the fishing pole into the water. Later, Wyatt showed her how to skip stones across the creek. Charlotte became fiercely competitive after discovering she was surprisingly good at it. "You cheated," Wyatt accused after her 5th successful skip. "You are merely bitter." "I'm deeply wounded." "You should recover quickly." Cold-hearted schoolteacher. Uncivilized rancher. Their smiles lingered too long afterward. One Saturday evening, Wyatt escorted Charlotte to a barn social several miles outside town. Charlotte nearly refused. Then Mrs. Bell informed her she was young, not deceased, and pushed her toward the door. The barn glowed with lantern light and music by the time they arrived. Fiddles played fast, lively tunes while couples danced across the wooden floor. Charlotte stopped short near the entrance. "Oh no," Wyatt looked down at her. "What?" "There are people." "Yes, Charlotte. That's generally considered a requirement for socials. So many people. You teach 23 children every day. Children are easier. That's because adults know when you're nervous." Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "You are enjoying this." "Tremendously." Several townspeople greeted them immediately. Charlotte noticed the reactions. Women smiled knowingly. Men smirked openly at Wyatt. One older rancher actually winked. Charlotte became alarmingly aware that she had arrived with Wyatt Emerson. As though sensing her panic, Wyatt leaned closer. "Relax." "I am perfectly relaxed." "You're crushing my arm." Charlotte released him instantly. Wyatt's grin widened. The man was intolerable. An hour later, Charlotte found herself dancing. Actual dancing. In public. With Wyatt. His hand rested warm and steady against her waist while the fiddle music swirled around them. Charlotte had danced before at formal Eastern gatherings, of course, but this was entirely different. No stiff politeness, no rehearsed movements. People laughed here, spun too fast, missed steps. Children darted between dancers. The joy of it all felt alive and uncontained. Wyatt guided her easily through the crowded floor. "You're thinking too hard again," he murmured. "I am attempting not to embarrass myself." "You won't. How can you possibly know that? Because you only get prettier when you're flustered." Charlotte nearly missed a step. Wyatt caught her smoothly before she stumbled. Her breath caught. The lantern light softened his features. His eyes looked darker tonight beneath the shadow of his hat brim. Too close, Charlotte thought. Far too close. And yet she did not move away. "You flirt shamelessly," she managed. "Only with you." Her pulse skipped traitorously. The music changed slower. Around them, couples drew closer together. Charlotte suddenly became very aware of Wyatt's hand against her back, very aware of the warmth of his body, very aware that when he looked at her like this, the rest of the room blurred strangely around the edges. "You know," Wyatt said softly, "you smile all the time now." Charlotte looked up at him. "I do not." "You do. That is exaggeration. You used to look at this town like it personally offended you. It was very muddy. It's still muddy." Charlotte laughed quietly. Wyatt's expression gentled again in that dangerous way she was beginning to recognize, the way that made her feel seen rather than merely admired. And somehow that was infinitely more frightening. Later that night, they stepped outside the barn for air. Music drifted faintly through the open doors behind them. Crickets chirped in the grass. Horses shifted near the hitching rail beneath silver moonlight. Charlotte stood beside the fence, catching her breath. "I cannot believe I danced for nearly an hour." "You danced for 2. Charlotte stared at him. "That cannot possibly be correct." "You lost track." "That seems unlikely." "You were having fun." Charlotte fell quiet. Fun. The word struck oddly deep. When had she last simply had fun before Montana? Before Wyatt? She honestly could not remember. Wyatt leaned beside her against the fence rail. "You miss Boston?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes." The truthful answer surprised her. "Not always. Not lately. I miss familiarity," she admitted. "But—" Charlotte looked out across the moonlit fields. "But I think," she hesitated, "I think perhaps I spent too much of my life trying to become the person everyone expected." Wyatt watched her carefully. "And now?" Charlotte laughed softly beneath her breath. "Now I chase goats through town and argue with cowboys. You left out threatening me with a fishing pole yesterday. You deserve that." "Probably." She smiled. Silence settled comfortably between them. Then, without warning, Wyatt reached up and gently removed a piece of hay caught in her hair. The touch was brief. Barely anything. Yet Charlotte felt it everywhere. Their eyes met. The night seemed to still around them. Charlotte's pulse fluttered wildly. Wyatt looked at her with startling intensity now. No teasing. No easy grin. Just heat. Warmth. Want. And something even more dangerous beneath it. Charlotte suddenly understood with terrifying clarity that if Wyatt Emerson kissed her tonight, she would let him. The realization shocked her enough that she stepped backward at once. Wyatt blinked slightly as though pulled from the same thought. Charlotte gathered herself quickly. "We should return inside." His gaze lingered on her face another moment. Then he nodded once. "Probably." Neither moved immediately. The music drifted softly behind them while moonlight silvered the open fields beyond the barn. Charlotte's heart would not slow. At last Wyatt straightened and offered her his arm again. This time, when Charlotte took it, her hand trembled just slightly. Wyatt noticed. Of course he noticed. But for once, he said nothing at all. By midsummer, Bitter Creek had fully accepted Charlotte Woodrow as one of its own. This revelation came to Charlotte in stages. First, Mrs. Bell stopped introducing her as the new teacher and began referring to her simply as Miss Charlotte. Second, children had started appearing at the boarding house door with gifts: wildflowers, fresh eggs, a suspiciously sticky kitten, and once, an extremely aggressive goose that Wyatt claimed was misunderstood. Third, and perhaps most alarming, Charlotte had begun arguing with Wyatt Emerson in public so regularly that townspeople now paused to enjoy it. "You are absolutely not bringing that animal into my classroom again," Charlotte informed him one morning while standing outside the schoolhouse. Wyatt held the goose beneath one arm. "She likes education. She bit Timothy Parker. Timothy insulted her. The goose chased him with malicious intent. Wyatt looked thoughtful. That does sound like her. Charlotte folded her arms. Several ranchers passing nearby slowed openly to listen. One of them muttered, $5 says she wins. Wyatt pointed toward the man without looking away from Charlotte. I heard that, Earl. Charlotte should have been mortified by such public attention. Instead, to her horror, she found herself laughing. Frequently, easily, and most often around Wyatt, which was becoming dangerous in entirely new ways. The annual Bitter Creek summer picnic arrived on a bright July afternoon. The entire town gathered in a sprawling meadow beside the creek. Wagons circled beneath cottonwood trees while long tables overflowed with food. Children ran barefoot through the grass, chasing one another with shrieks of laughter. Fiddlers played lively music beneath a canvas shade. Ribbons fluttered in the breeze. The mountains rose blue and distant beyond the valley. Charlotte stood near the dessert table holding a pie she deeply regretted making. Mrs. Bell peered critically at it. What happened to the crust? Charlotte sighed. I followed the recipe exactly. Mrs. Bell poked the pie gently. It appears to have declared war on itself. Charlotte looked mournfully at the collapsed blackberry disaster. I do not understand. Back east, I baked perfectly respectable pies. Mrs. Bell snorted. That's because Eastern pies don't have to survive Montana weather. Nearby, Wyatt appeared as though summoned by Charlotte's humiliation. He glanced at the pie, then at Charlotte, then back at the pie. His mouth twitched violently. Careful, Charlotte warned. I didn't say anything. You are thinking aggressively. Wyatt finally lost the battle and laughed outright. Several nearby townspeople joined immediately. Charlotte narrowed her eye. You are all deeply cruel. Wyatt picked up a spoon. I'm brave enough to try it. You absolutely are not. Too late. Wyatt scooped a bite into his mouth. The crowd waited. Wyatt chewed thoughtfully. Charlotte braced herself. Then Wyatt nodded solemnly. Well, Mrs. Bell crossed herself. Charlotte glared. Just say it. Wyatt swallowed carefully. I think your pie may actually improve with distance. Laughter erupted around them. Charlotte gasped in outrage while Wyatt grinned like a man moments from death. You barbarian. I ate the pie. That's commitment. You insulted the pie while eating the pie. Multitasking. Charlotte snatched the spoon from him. Wyatt laughed harder. And then Charlotte realized something strange. People were watching them. Not rudely, warmly, as though seeing something expected unfolding before their eyes. Several women exchanged knowing smiles. An older rancher murmured, Told you. Charlotte immediately became flustered. Wyatt, unfortunately, noticed at once. There's that blush again. There is no blush. You're red as a sunset. I am warm. You're adorable when you lie. Charlotte nearly dropped the spoon. How did this man say such things so casually? Worse, how had she reached the point where those words no longer offended her nearly enough? The picnic games began shortly afterward. Children raced in potato sacks. Men competed in horseshoe contests. Women entered preserves and quilts for judging. Charlotte intended to observe quietly from a safe distance. Unfortunately, Wyatt Emerson had other plans. You're entering the race. Charlotte looked up sharply from her lemonade. The what? The race. Across the meadow, several townspeople were gathering near a makeshift starting line. It's only around the creek and back. Charlotte stared at him. You cannot possibly believe I would participate in public athletic competition. That sounded extremely Eastern. It sounded sensible. Wyatt leaned closer. You're scared. Charlotte straightened instantly. I am not. Then prove it. She narrowed her eyes. Wyatt grinned. The man manipulated her shamelessly. The truly horrifying part was that she recognized this completely and still found herself marching toward the starting line 10 minutes later. Mrs. Mercer looked delighted. Mrs. Bell looked concerned for public safety. Wyatt looked unbearably pleased with himself. Charlotte pointed a finger at him. If I perish during this event, I shall haunt you personally. I'd expect nothing less. The race included 4 teenage boys, 2 ranch hands, 1 determined woman named Clara Finch, and, absurdly, Charlotte herself. The townspeople gathered cheering around the field. Charlotte's heart hammered. What am I doing? she muttered. Having fun, Wyatt said immediately. She looked at him. Sunlight caught the gold-brown strands in his hair beneath his hat. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. And suddenly Charlotte realized something deeply alarming. She liked who she was becoming around him, not merely happier, braver, louder, more alive. "Ready?" someone shouted. Charlotte took position. "Set." Wyatt cupped his hands around his mouth. "Don't let the teenagers shame you, Charlotte." Several people laughed. Charlotte shot him a scandalized glare. Then the race began. At first, Charlotte ran with pure dignity. By the halfway point, dignity had abandoned her entirely. Dust flew beneath her boots as she raced around the creek bend. Children shouted encouragement. Wind tore loose strands of hair from her pin. One of the teenage boys slipped in the grass. Charlotte passed him triumphantly. "Oh heavens," she gasped between breaths. "I'm competitive." The realization shocked her, then delighted her. By the time she neared the finish line, Charlotte was laughing outright, actually laughing, wildly, freely. The crowd roared. Wyatt shouted something utterly indecent about schoolteachers. Charlotte crossed the line in second place behind Clara Finch and nearly collapsed into the grass breathless. People clapped and cheered around her. Charlotte pushed loose hair from her face and looked up toward Wyatt. He had gone strangely still, not laughing now, just staring at her. Charlotte's pulse skipped. He crossed the field toward her slowly. "You cheated," he said softly. Still breathless, Charlotte frowned. "How?" "You pretended to be civilized." She laughed again. Wyatt looked completely undone by the sound. And for one terrifying suspended moment, Charlotte realized he was looking at her not with amusement anymore, but with unmistakable admiration. Something deeper flickered beneath it, too. Something warm enough to steal breath. Charlotte's own smile faded slightly as the moment stretched between them. Then Clara Finch approached, waving her prize ribbon triumphantly. "Miss Woodrow!" she cried. "I never thought I'd see the day." Charlotte blinked. The day of what? The day Wyatt Emerson fell in love. Silence. Absolute silence. Charlotte froze. Several nearby townspeople immediately became fascinated by clouds, food, and absolutely anything else. Wyatt rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. Clara looked around innocently. "What?" Charlotte's heartbeat became violent. Wyatt's eyes locked with hers. Neither spoke. Then Clara sighed dramatically. "Oh, for heaven's sake, if the two of you stare any harder, the whole meadow's liable to catch fire." Mrs. Bell burst out laughing nearby. Charlotte wanted the earth to open beneath her immediately. Wyatt, infuriatingly, only smiled, slowly, warmly, directly at her, and Charlotte realized with horrifying clarity, Clara Finch might not be entirely wrong. After the picnic, Bitter Creek became unbearable, not because anyone said anything directly. That would have been easier. No. The problem was the smiles. The knowing smiles, the glances, the suspiciously timed silences whenever Charlotte entered a room where Wyatt Emerson had recently been discussed. Mrs. Bell had become particularly insufferable. "You're humming," she observed one morning over breakfast. Charlotte nearly dropped her coffee cup. "I am not." "You are, I assure you, and you've worn the blue dress 3 times this week." Charlotte stared at her in horror. Mrs. Bell buttered toast calmly. "That's courting behavior. We are not courting." Charlotte rose from the table immediately. Retreat was the only remaining option. Unfortunately, the moment she stepped outside, she found Wyatt waiting beside the boarding house fence holding 2 horses. Charlotte stopped short. He smiled slowly. Her pulse betrayed her instantly. "I dislike that expression," she informed him. "What expression?" "The one that says you know exactly why I'm flustered." "You are flustered?" "You are impossible." Wyatt looked delighted. "That's my favorite answer." Charlotte tried very hard not to smile. She failed slightly. Wyatt noticed, naturally. He always noticed. "Come riding with me," he said. Charlotte eyed the horses suspiciously. "Where?" "Nowhere dangerous." "That is not reassuring when spoken by you." He laughed softly. The sound warmed her all the way through now, which felt like a personal failure. Still, Charlotte found herself taking the reins he offered. Again, They rode north of town through open country brushed gold by late afternoon sunlight. Cottonwoods lined the winding creek while distant mountains rose blue against the enormous sky. Charlotte had become a far better rider over the summer. She no longer clung to the saddle in terror, mostly. Though when Daisy startled briefly at a rabbit darting through the grass, Charlotte still made a noise Wyatt described afterward as deeply educational. "You laughed," she accused. "You sounded offended by nature itself. It moved unexpectedly. That's generally how rabbits operate." Charlotte glared at him. Wyatt grinned. Then his expression softened as he looked at her. It happened more often lately. Those quiet pauses. Those moments where teasing faded and something warmer emerged underneath. Something neither of them seemed brave enough to name yet. Charlotte looked away first. Dangerous. Always dangerous. They stopped beside a shallow river where water rushed clear over smooth stones. Wyatt dismounted easily and tied the horses beneath a cottonwood tree. Charlotte climbed down more carefully. "Well," Wyatt said, "you survived." "I continue to amaze us both. You know," he said thoughtfully, 6 weeks ago you looked at horses like they were instruments of death. They remained suspicious creatures. But now you ride." Charlotte brushed dust from her skirt. Reluctantly, "You smile while riding." "I do not." "You absolutely do." Charlotte opened her mouth to deny it, then stopped, because he was right, again. And the truly startling thing was, she liked it here now. The river, the wind, the wildness, the freedom. She liked the version of herself Montana was slowly uncovering, and most frightening of all, she liked the version of herself Wyatt seemed to see. Wyatt skipped a stone across the water. Charlotte watched it bounce 6 times. That was showing off. Correct. She attempted the same and managed only 2 skips. Wyatt looked offended. "You're improving too fast. It's unsettling." Charlotte laughed softly. The river sparkled around them beneath the lowering sun. Then, unexpectedly, Wyatt fell quiet. Charlotte noticed immediately. His easy confidence rarely disappeared completely. But now something thoughtful settled over him. "You all right?" she asked. Wyatt shrugged one shoulder. "Sure." Charlotte narrowed her eyes slightly. "You are a very poor liar. That hurts my feelings. You should recover quickly." His smile returned briefly, then faded again. Charlotte hesitated. About whispers. About the version of Wyatt Emerson the town had created long before she arrived. "You care more than you pretend," she said quietly. Wyatt huffed a soft laugh. "Maybe." Charlotte sat carefully on a fallen log near the water. "You know," she said after a moment, "back east there were men with perfect manners and spotless reputations who behaved terribly when no one was looking." Wyatt glanced at her. "And here," she continued softly, "I find a man everyone calls reckless who spends half his life helping widows repair fences and carving birds for children." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression. Not teasing now, not charm, something raw. "You notice too much," he murmured. Charlotte's heartbeat stumbled. The late sunlight filtered gold through the trees around them. Wind stirred gently through the cottonwoods overhead. "You know what the funny part is?" Wyatt said quietly. "What?" "You still look at me like I'm dangerous." Charlotte swallowed, because the terrifying truth was, he was. Not dangerous in the way the town meant. Dangerous because he made her feel too much. Because every time he smiled at her, some careful wall inside her weakened further. Because she had begun imagining impossible things. A future here, a home, Wyatt waiting for her at the end of each day. Dangerous indeed. "You are dangerous," she admitted softly. Wyatt's gaze locked with hers. "Am I?" Charlotte's breath caught. "You make me forget how to behave properly." His smile turned slow and devastating. "Charlotte," he said gently, "I've seen you threaten a goose with a grammar book. That goose was lawless." Wyatt laughed quietly. The tension eased slightly, but only slightly, because something larger still lingered between them now. Something inevitable. The sun drifted lower. Amber light spilled across the riverbank while shadows lengthened beneath the trees. Charlotte removed her gloves absently and trailed her fingertips through the cool water. "It's strange," she said softly. "What is?" "How different my life feels now." Wyatt sat beside her on the log, not touching, Close enough to feel warm anyway. You regret coming here? Charlotte looked out across the river, then slowly shook her head. No. The answer surprised her with its certainty. She thought of Boston now, and it felt smaller somehow, dimmer, as though she had spent years quietly waiting for herself to begin. I used to think being good meant being quiet, she admitted. Wyatt frowned slightly. Who told you that? No one directly. She smiled faintly. But women are taught certain things. Sounds exhausting. Charlotte laughed softly. It was. And now? Charlotte looked down at her hand. Now I climb onto horses and race through fields and argue with cowboys in public. You left out smiling more. She glanced up at him, and laughing. His voice softened further, and looking alive. Charlotte's chest tightened painfully, because no one had ever said something like that to her before. Not truly. Not in a way that made her feel seen all the way through. The air between them grew still. Wyatt's gaze drifted slowly over her face. Not rushed. Not careless. Intent. Charlotte's pulse fluttered wildly. He lifted one hand slightly, paused, as though giving her time to retreat. Charlotte did not move. Wyatt's fingers brushed a loose strand of hair near her cheek. The touch was feather-light, yet Charlotte felt it everywhere. Neither spoke. The river rushed softly beside them. Wind moved gently through the trees overhead, and then Wyatt said quietly, "You know what the real problem is?" Charlotte's voice came barely above a whisper. "What?" "I think about you constantly." Her breath caught. Wyatt looked almost frustrated by his own honesty now. "You walk into a room and suddenly I can't remember what I was doing." Charlotte's heart pounded so hard it hurt. "Wyatt, you smile at me and I start acting like an idiot. That hardly seems new." He laughed softly. Then his expression turned serious again. "And the worst part is," his voice lowered, "I don't even care." Charlotte stared at him. The entire world seemed to narrow to this moment, this riverbank, this man. "I think," Wyatt said quietly, "I've been in trouble since the first day you glared at me in the mud." Charlotte's laugh escaped shakily, then faded as they continued looking at one another. Close now. Too close. Wyatt's gaze dropped briefly to her mouth. Charlotte stopped breathing. Every sensible thought she possessed vanished completely. And somehow, in the middle of all that silence and sunlight and rushing water, she realized she wanted him to kiss her. Not cautiously, not politely, completely. The realization terrified her. It also felt wonderfully inevitable. Wyatt's hand lifted slowly to her cheek. Warm, gentle, careful in a way no one would expect from him. Charlotte leaned into his touch before she could stop herself. Wyatt's eyes darkened instantly. Then, very softly, almost rough with restraint, "Charlotte." The way he said her name unraveled her completely. She whispered before courage failed her, "You make me feel brave." Something in Wyatt's expression broke open, and then he kissed her, slowly at first, as though giving her every chance to pull away. Charlotte did not. She moved toward him instead with a small, breathless sound that seemed to undo the last of his restraint entirely. His hand cupped her face gently while the other settled at her waist. The kiss deepened. Warm, tender, certain. Charlotte felt the whole world tilt beneath her. All the careful years of her life suddenly seemed very far away, because nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing. When Wyatt finally drew back, both of them were breathing unevenly. Charlotte stared at him, dazed. Wyatt rested his forehead lightly against hers and laughed once under his breath. "Well," he murmured softly, "that's probably going to make town gossip worse." Charlotte laughed helplessly, then kissed him again before she could remember how not to. After Wyatt Emerson kissed her beside the river, Charlotte Woodrow forgot how to behave normally. This became evident almost immediately. On Monday morning, one of her students asked why she was smiling at the multiplication tables. Charlotte promptly wrote the wrong answer to 7 times 8 on the blackboard. The class stared in collective alarm. "Miss Woodrow," little Elsie Emerson said carefully, "are you poorly?" Charlotte erased the number at once. "No." Tommy Pike squinted suspiciously. "You look different." Charlotte's cheeks warmed. "Different how?" Tommy considered this gravely. "Happier." The entire classroom erupted into knowing giggles. Charlotte nearly dropped the chalk. "Children," she realized with horror, noticed everything, especially when their schoolteacher suddenly spent half the day staring absent-mindedly out windows thinking about a certain cowboy's mouth. Very improper, very distracting, very impossible to regret. Meanwhile, Bitter Creek had entered what Mrs. Bell described as the unbearable stage. "You're glowing," Mrs. Bell announced over breakfast. Charlotte choked on coffee. "I am not glowing. You absolutely are." Mrs. Bell narrowed her eyes. "Did Wyatt Emerson kiss you?" Charlotte nearly died on the spot. "Mrs. Bell, well?" Charlotte could not answer. Unfortunately, her silence answered quite enough. Mrs. Bell sat back triumphantly. "I knew it." Charlotte covered her face with both hands. "This town is impossible." "No," Mrs. Bell corrected calmly. "This town is bored." Charlotte groaned softly into her palm. Outside the boarding house window, someone whistled. Charlotte recognized the whistle instantly, which was becoming another problem entirely. Mrs. Bell smirked openly. "There's your cowboy now." Charlotte attempted dignity as she stood. She failed because she smiled before reaching the door. Mrs. Bell saw that too. "Oh dear," the older woman murmured. "You're done for." Charlotte suspected she might be right. Wyatt waited beside the hitching rail looking entirely too handsome in the morning sunlight. Charlotte had noticed this recently. How broad his shoulders looked beneath worn flannel, how warm his eyes became when he saw her, how his smile changed now. Not flirtation anymore. Something deeper, something that made her heart feel too full inside her chest. The moment Charlotte stepped outside, Wyatt's entire expression softened. There it was again, that look, as though seeing her remained his favorite part of every day. "Morning, schoolteacher." Charlotte tried for composure. "Good morning." Wyatt studied her suspiciously. "You're blushing already. I haven't even said anything yet. That is entirely your fault somehow." "Probably." He leaned closer slightly. "You've been thinking about me?" Charlotte gave him a scandalized look. Wyatt grinned slowly. "That's a yes." The truly terrible thing was, it absolutely was. The next several days passed in a warm blur of stolen moment. Wyatt walked her home nearly every evening now. Sometimes they talked for hours on the boarding house steps beneath the stars. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they simply sat together quietly while summer wind rustled through the cottonwoods nearby. Charlotte discovered she liked all of it. Even the silence felt easy with him, especially the silence. One evening, Wyatt brought her wildflowers gathered from a meadow north of town. Unfortunately, he handed them over while standing directly outside the mercantile where at least 14 people witnessed it. The reactions were immediate. Old Mrs. Parker gasped dramatically. Two teenage girls looked personally betrayed. Earl Jenkins muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Charlotte became so flustered she nearly dropped the flower. Wyatt looked delighted by her suffering. "You enjoy this far too much," she whispered furiously. "You're cute when you panic." "I am not panicking. You just thanked a barrel." Charlotte looked down. To her horror, she had indeed just smiled politely at a barrel while distracted. Wyatt laughed so hard he had to steady himself against the hitching rail. Charlotte wanted very badly to remain offended. Unfortunately, she started laughing too. And then Wyatt looked at her with such open affection that her entire protest dissolved. Dangerous. Hopelessly dangerous. But by late August, trouble crept quietly into Bitter Creek. It began with missing cattle, then broken fences, then rumors of a gang operating north of the valley, stealing livestock from isolated ranches. Men in town grew tense. Conversations lowered when Charlotte approached. Several ranchers began riding patrols at night. And Wyatt grew watchful. Charlotte noticed it immediately. He still smiled around her, still teased her, still looked at her like she hung the stars over Montana. But beneath it all, something sharper had appeared. Alertness. One evening, Charlotte found him outside the general store speaking quietly with Sheriff Collins and several ranchers. The mood felt wrong, heavy. Wyatt saw her approaching and his expression softened instantly. Still, Charlotte sensed the strain underneath. "What's happened?" she asked quietly once the others moved away. Wyatt hesitated. "Probably nothing." "That means definitely something." His mouth twitched briefly. "Maybe." Charlotte folded her arms. Wyatt. He sighed softly. Cattle thieves hit the Miller ranch last night. Shot one of the dogs. Charlotte's stomach tightened. Will they return? Don't know. But you're going after them. Not a question. Wyatt looked away briefly toward the darkening horizon. Somebody has to. Charlotte suddenly disliked this conversation very much. Fear curled coldly beneath her ribs. Wyatt noticed immediately. Hey, his voice gentled. Don't do that. Do what? Look scared. Charlotte tried to hide it. Failed. You could get hurt. Wyatt stepped closer. Warm evening wind moved softly around them while lantern light flickered across the street. I'll be careful. You are many things, Charlotte informed him tightly. But careful has never once appeared on that list. He smiled faintly, then reached up and brushed his knuckles gently against her cheek. I'll come back to you. The simple certainty in his voice nearly undid her. Charlotte hated how much that mattered now. How deeply this man had woven himself into her heart before she fully realized what was happening. She loved him. The realization arrived suddenly and completely. Not infatuation, not excitement. Love. Wild and terrifying and absolute. Charlotte looked up at him and knew from the way Wyatt was looking at her. He already knew it too. The confrontation came 3 nights later. Charlotte woke shortly after midnight to shouting outside the boarding house. Then horses. Fast. Urgent. Mrs. Bell appeared in the hallway already wearing a robe. What is it? A man outside shouted something about the Miller ranch. Charlotte's blood went cold instantly. Wyatt. She knew somehow before anyone said his name. Charlotte hurried downstairs. Several townspeople crowded the street carrying lanterns. Faces looked grim beneath the shifting light. Sheriff Collins rode into town with 3 other men. One horse lacked a rider. Charlotte's stomach dropped violently. Then another rider emerged from the darkness behind them. Wyatt. Alive. But slumped badly in the saddle. Charlotte did not remember crossing the street. One moment she stood frozen beneath the boarding house lantern. The next she was reaching Wyatt just as 2 ranchers helped him dismount. Blood stained his shirt near the shoulder. Charlotte stopped breathing. Wyatt. He looked up at the sound of her voice. And somehow, despite blood, despite exhaustion, despite pain, he smiled. There's my girl. Charlotte's eyes burned instantly. You are injured. Little bit. Sheriff Collins snorted. Boy took a rifle butt saving Tom Miller from getting shot. Charlotte turned sharply. What happened? Thieves got cornered near the North Ridge, the sheriff explained. One aimed at Miller. Wyatt stepped in before the fool fired. Charlotte looked back at Wyatt in horror. You stepped in front of a gun? Wyatt winced slightly. In hindsight, seemed dramatic. Charlotte could have cried from relief and fury simultaneously. Instead, she pointed toward the boarding house with terrifying calm. You are coming inside. Wyatt blinked, then obediently followed. Every single rancher in town looked astonished. Mrs. Bell leaned toward Sheriff Collins. Well, she whispered loudly, he's officially hers now. Charlotte cleaned Wyatt's injuries in the boarding house kitchen while Mrs. Bell pretended not to hover nearby, listening to everything. Wyatt sat in a chair with his shirt partly open while Charlotte carefully cleaned the bruise along his shoulder and collarbone. Her hands trembled slightly. Wyatt noticed. Hey. Charlotte refused to look at him. You frightened me. His expression softened immediately. I know. You could have been killed. Charlotte. You stepped in front of a rifle. Tom Miller's got 3 little girls. Charlotte's anger faltered instantly. Of course that would be his answer. Because this reckless, impossible man would throw himself into danger for other people without hesitation. Wyatt watched her quietly, then reached for her hand. Charlotte finally looked up. Lantern light flickered softly across his face. His eyes looked tired now beneath the bruising along his jaw. You all right? He asked gently. Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. You are bleeding and asking if I am all right. You look upset. I am upset. Wyatt smiled faintly. Kinda sweet, honestly. Charlotte made a strangled sound of frustration. Then, to her horror, tears filled her eyes. Wyatt's expression changed instantly. All teasing vanished. Hey, he said softly. Charlotte looked away at once, embarrassed. I do not cry. You absolutely do. This is different. Wyatt's thumb brushed gently across her knuckles. Charlotte, The tenderness in his voice broke the last of her composure completely. She whispered shakily, "I love you." Silence filled the little kitchen. Mrs. Bell immediately turned around and began washing the same plate repeatedly for privacy. Wyatt stared at Charlotte like she had just handed him the entire world. Then he stood despite her protests about injuries and pulled her gently against him. Charlotte buried her face against his chest at once. His arms wrapped around her carefully, securely. Like home, Wyatt pressed his cheek softly against her hair and laughed once under his breath. "You know," he murmured, voice rough with emotion, "I've been yours since the first day you glared at me in the mud." Charlotte laughed tearfully against him. Then Wyatt tilted her face upward and kissed her slowly while lantern light glowed warm around them and Montana wind whispered softly outside the windows. Autumn arrived softly in Bitter Creek. The cottonwoods along the river turned gold first, their leaves flashing bright against the deep blue Montana sky. Mornings carried a crisp chill now, and wood smoke curled from chimneys throughout town by sunrise. Charlotte Woodrow loved it. The realization still startled her sometimes. Loved the mountains, loved the wild wind, loved the sprawling, untamed beauty of Montana territory, and loved, well, that part no longer startled her at all. She loved Wyatt Emerson with such certainty now that it seemed impossible she had ever tried to resist him, though she still attempted to maintain a small amount of dignity, occasionally, not successfully. "You're smiling at nothing again," Mrs. Bell informed her one evening. Charlotte glanced up from grading papers. "I beg your pardon. You've got that look." "What look?" "The Wyatt Emerson look." Charlotte nearly stabbed herself with her pen. "There is no such thing." Mrs. Bell snorted. "Honey, half this town knows when that man's kissed you recently." Charlotte made a sound of pure horror. Mrs. Bell looked delighted. "You turn pink clear to your ears. I shall move back east immediately." "No, you won't," Charlotte sighed, because they both knew she wouldn't. Not anymore. Montana had become home, and Wyatt had become the center of it. 3 days later, Charlotte finished lessons just before sunset. The children thundered out of the schoolhouse in their usual chaos while Charlotte gathered papers from her desk. Outside, wind rustled dry autumn leaves across the porch. Then came familiar footsteps. Charlotte smiled before she could stop herself. Wyatt leaned casually in the doorway. "You smiled before seeing me," he observed smugly. Charlotte did not look up. "You are impossible to miss. You walk like a cattle stampede." "That sounds handsome somehow." "It was not intended that way." He grinned. The bruise along his jaw from the cattle thief incident had faded now, though Charlotte still occasionally caught herself touching his shoulder gently, as if reassuring herself he was truly all right. Wyatt noticed that too. He noticed everything. "You busy tonight?" he asked. "I had intended to correct arithmetic." "That sounds tragic." "It is responsible. You spend too much time being responsible." Charlotte finally looked at him. "Someone must." Wyatt pushed away from the doorway and crossed toward her desk slowly. "Come riding with me." Charlotte narrowed her eyes slightly. "That tone concerns me." "What tone?" "The one that suggests you are planning something." His grin widened. "You know me too well now." Charlotte's pulse fluttered lightly. The truth was, she did. She knew the difference between his real smile and his teasing one, knew the quiet moods he hid beneath humor, knew when he was worried, tired, restless, or pretending not to care, and somehow he knew her just as well, perhaps better. Dangerous still, hopelessly dangerous, yet no longer frightening. Not really, because Wyatt Emerson had never once made her feel smaller, only braver, more herself. An hour later, they rode north through rolling hills brushed amber beneath the setting sun. Charlotte pulled her coat tighter against the cool wind. "You still haven't told me where we're going." "You ask too many questions." "That is because you answer too few." Wyatt laughed softly. The sound drifted warm through the autumn air. They rode in comfortable silence a while before reaching a ridge overlooking the valley below. Charlotte drew in a quiet breath. The view stole what little remained of it. The entire Bitter Creek Valley stretched beneath them, glowing gold and copper in the fading light. The river wound silver through the trees, while distant mountains blushed purple beneath the sunset. "Oh," Charlotte whispered. Wyatt watched her instead of the view. Charlotte noticed. Of course she noticed. "You've been up here before?" she asked softly. "All the time. And you never brought me?" "Was waiting." "For what?" Wyatt looked strangely nervous suddenly. Charlotte blinked. Nervous? This man had once stared down armed cattle thieves without flinching. Yet now he rubbed one hand across the back of his neck like a schoolboy about to confess wrongdoing. Charlotte's heartbeat quickened. Wyatt dismounted first, then helped her carefully down from Daisy. His hands lingered lightly at her waist afterward. Neither moved away immediately. Wind swept softly across the ridge, lifting loose strands of Charlotte's hair. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. "Well," he muttered, "had a better speech planned." Charlotte's lips twitched. "A speech?" "Yeah. Turns out I'm bad at speeches. I cannot imagine why." That sounded insulting. It was slightly insulting. Wyatt laughed once under his breath, but he still looked nervous. Charlotte had never seen him like this before. And suddenly, she knew. Her heart began pounding so hard she felt dizzy. Wyatt took off his hat and looked down at it briefly before meeting her eyes again. "You know," he began slowly, "my whole life people kept trying to tell me what mattered." Charlotte listened quietly. "Money, reputation, land." He shrugged slightly. "Never cared much about any of it." The sunset glowed warm across his face. "Then you showed up in Bitter Creek looking at everybody like we were uncivilized lunatics." Charlotte laughed softly through rising emotion. "And somehow," Wyatt continued, voice roughening slightly, "you made everything feel different." Charlotte's eyes burned instantly. "You make this place feel like home," he said quietly. "Oh heavens." Charlotte pressed one hand lightly against her chest. Wyatt looked briefly frustrated again. "See, this is why I needed the speech. You're pretty, and now I can't think properly." Charlotte laughed tearfully. Wyatt stepped closer, close enough that she could feel warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "I love you, Charlotte Woodrow." His voice softened completely now. "More than my own freedom." Charlotte's breath caught. Wyatt smiled faintly. "And that's saying something." A tear slipped down Charlotte's cheek before she could stop it. Wyatt immediately looked alarmed. "Oh no. Are those bad tears?" She laughed helplessly. "No. You sure?" "Yes, because I can try again." Charlotte shook her head quickly, still laughing through tears. "You impossible man." "Yeah." His expression gentled. "But I'm your impossible man." The words wrapped around her heart completely. Wyatt reached slowly into his coat pocket. Charlotte stopped breathing altogether. He pulled out a small velvet box. Charlotte stared at it in shock. "You bought a ring?" "Well, I wasn't proposing with a potato." She burst into startled laughter. Wyatt looked relieved. "Good. Laughing's better than crying. I panic during crying." Charlotte could barely see through tears now. Wyatt opened the little box carefully. Inside rested a delicate gold ring set with a small, pale blue stone that flashed like Montana sky. "It belonged to my grandmother," he said quietly. "Figured she'd haunt me if I gave it to anybody but the right woman." Charlotte looked up at him. Every wild, impossible thing she had once feared suddenly felt wonderfully inevitable. This man, this place, this life. Wyatt took one breath, then another, then finally, "Charlotte, will you marry me?" Silence filled the ridge, the wind, the mountains, the glowing valley below. Everything held still around them. Charlotte thought briefly of Boston, of the careful, lonely life she once imagined for herself. Then she looked at Wyatt Emerson standing before her with nervous hope written openly across his face. And there had never been an easier answer in her entire life. "Yes." Wyatt blinked once. "Yeah?" Charlotte laughed through happy tears. "Yes, you ridiculous man." Wyatt's entire face transformed. Pure joy. Unrestrained and boyish and beautiful. Before Charlotte could say another word, he caught her around the waist and lifted her clear off the ground. Charlotte shrieked in startled laughter. "Wyatt, you said yes. You're crushing my ribs. You love it." Charlotte absolutely did. He set her down only long enough to slide the ring carefully onto her finger. Then he kissed her. Not cautiously this time, not uncertainly, like a man overwhelmed with happiness. Charlotte kissed him back just as fiercely while Montana wind swept around them and the valley glowed gold below. When they finally pulled apart, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard. "Well," he murmured, grinning helplessly, "this is probably gonna kill half the women in Bitter Creek." Charlotte laughed. "Oh dear, you think I'm joking? I think you're arrogant." "Accurate, though." Charlotte shook her head fondly. Then Wyatt's grin turned wicked. "You know Earl Jenkins owes me $20 now." Charlotte blinked. "What?" "There were bets. You allowed people to wager on our relationship? There were excellent odds." Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. Wyatt looked delighted with himself. "You are impossible. Future Mrs. Emerson sounds nice, though, doesn't it?" Charlotte's heart fluttered warmly at the words. Future Mrs. Emerson. How extraordinary. How impossible. How perfect. The sun dipped lower behind the mountains as Wyatt pulled her gently against him again. Below them, Bitter Creek glowed warmly beneath the autumn sky, and for the first time in her life, Charlotte Woodrow felt absolutely certain exactly where she belonged. By the time winter melted into spring again, the entire Montana territory appeared aware that Wyatt Emerson was getting married, and Bitter Creek had opinions. Strong opinions. "Still can't believe it," Earl Jenkins declared for perhaps the 50th time while standing outside the mercantile. Wyatt Emerson, voluntarily surrendering. "I ain't surrendering," Wyatt replied lazily from where he leaned against the hitching rail. "I'm upgrading." Several nearby ranchers groaned loudly. Charlotte, exiting the mercantile carrying fabric for wedding alterations, immediately turned pink. Wyatt's eyes warmed the moment he saw her. There it was again. That look, as though no matter how many times he saw her, he still couldn't quite believe she was real. Charlotte had stopped pretending. That look didn't undo her completely. "Morning, future wife. You are insufferably pleased with yourself." "Correct." Earl shook his head dramatically. "Town's never gonna recover from this." "That's because half the women in Bitter Creek are mourning," Wyatt replied. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "Oh?" Wyatt grinned slowly. "You jealous, sweetheart?" Charlotte lifted her chin. "Certainly not. Liar." The word came soft and affectionate, warm enough to make her heart stumble. Still, Charlotte looked around meaningfully at the nearby women, pretending not to stare. "You do seem to have admirers." Wyatt shrugged. "Only interested in one woman." Charlotte tried not to smile. She failed. Wyatt looked unbearably satisfied. Wedding preparations consumed the town completely. Mrs. Bell took command of decorations with military authority. Mrs. Mercer organized food. Clara Finch insisted Charlotte required something blue and something scandalously romantic. Charlotte feared that phrase tremendously. Children gathered wildflowers daily for the church. Even the ranchers helped build long reception tables beneath the cottonwoods near the creek. The entire town seemed determined to celebrate as though Bitter Creek itself were marrying Wyatt Emerson, which, in some ways, perhaps it was. Charlotte learned quickly that Wyatt had belonged to this town long before he belonged to her, and yet somehow, he looked at Charlotte as though she alone was home. The night before the wedding, Charlotte barely slept, not from fear, from wonder. She sat near the boarding house window long after midnight, watching moonlight silver the quiet street below. Tomorrow she would become Charlotte Emerson. The thought still felt astonishing. A soft knock sounded at her door. Charlotte opened it to find Wyatt standing in the hallway holding his hat awkwardly in both hands. She blinked. "You are absolutely not supposed to be here." "Probably not. You could bring bad luck." Wyatt leaned against the doorway. "Sweetheart, I once survived a stampede, 2 broken ribs, and your blackberry pie. I think we're all right." Charlotte laughed softly, then her expression gentle. "What are you doing here?" Wyatt looked suddenly less certain of himself. That still startled her every time. The only thing on earth capable of making Wyatt Emerson nervous seemed to be loving her. "Wanted to see you." Charlotte's heart melted immediately. "You shall see me tomorrow." "I know." He rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. "Just feels big." Charlotte stepped closer. "Yes," she whispered. "It's strange." Wyatt smiled faintly. "Spent most of my life thinking I wasn't built for marriage." Charlotte lifted a brow. "Because you enjoy annoying people too much?" "Partly." She laughed quietly. Then Wyatt's expression softened. but mostly because nobody ever felt like home before. Charlotte's eyes burned instantly. Oh heavens! This man. She reached for his hand gently. "You know," she said softly, "back in Boston, I used to think love would feel very calm and proper." Wyatt looked alarmed. "That sounds terrible." Charlotte laughed through tears. "But this," she squeezed his hand lightly, "this feels alive." Wyatt stared at her with so much love in his face it nearly stole her breath. Then he kissed her forehead gently. "Go to sleep, Charlotte. You first." "Can't. Too excited. You are behaving like a child before Christmas." "That's because tomorrow I get you." Charlotte smiled helplessly. "Good night, Wyatt. Good night, future Mrs. Emerson." And somehow, impossibly, she fell even more in love with him after he said it. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. Golden sunlight spilled across Bitter Creek while the whole town buzzed with excitement. Charlotte stood before the small mirror in Mrs. Bell's room while Clara and Mrs. Mercer finished pinning her hair. Her wedding dress was simple but beautiful. Soft ivory fabric, high lace collar, tiny pearl buttons, and delicate embroidered flowers sewn carefully along the sleeves. Wildflowers woven into her hair added touches of blue and gold. Charlotte barely recognized herself. Mrs. Bell sniffed loudly behind her. "Oh dear," she muttered emotionally. "You look lovely enough to stop traffic." Clara grinned. "Or kill Wyatt outright." Charlotte laughed nervously. Then her expression faltered slightly. "What if I trip?" "You won't." "What if I faint?" "You won't." "What if Wyatt says something outrageous during the ceremony?" All three women paused thoughtfully. "That one's possible," Mrs. Bell admitted. Charlotte groaned softly. Meanwhile, outside the church, Wyatt Emerson was indeed causing problems. "You look terrified," Sheriff Collins observed cheerfully. Wyatt adjusted his collar for the 6th time. "I'm fine. You've nearly worn a trench pacing holes through the dirt." Earl Jenkins snorted. "Boy looks like he's heading to execution." Wyatt glared at him, then immediately looked toward the church doors again. Nervous energy radiated from him, because despite all the teasing, despite all the swagger, Wyatt Emerson genuinely could not believe Charlotte Woodrow had chosen him. And somewhere deep inside himself, the reckless boy everyone once dismissed still feared waking up and finding it all gone. Sheriff Collins noticed the shift in his expression. "She loves you, son." Wyatt swallowed one. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." Then the church doors opened, and every coherent thought in Wyatt Emerson's head vanished completely. Charlotte appeared on Mrs. Mercer's arm beneath a shower of spring sunlight. The entire church fell silent. Wyatt stared. Good Lord. She was beautiful. Not merely pretty, not merely elegant, beautiful in a way that reached straight into his chest and held on tight. Charlotte's eyes found his instantly, and then she smiled. Small, soft, certain. Wyatt's throat tightened painfully. Earl whispered beside him, "Well, hell, he's gone. Completely, utterly, gone." Charlotte walked slowly down the aisle while the church glowed warm with candlelight and spring flowers. Children peeked between pews. Women dabbed tears. Men cleared throats suspiciously. And Wyatt looked at Charlotte like she was the greatest thing God had ever made. The sight nearly stole her composure entirely. When she finally reached him, Wyatt took her hands immediately. Warm, steady, reverent somehow. "You're staring," Charlotte whispered shakily. "Can't help it." Several nearby people laughed softly. The minister smiled, knowing. The ceremony itself blurred around Charlotte afterward. She remembered fragments. Wyatt's thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles, sunlight through church windows, the sound of his voice when he said her name. But most of all, she remembered the vows. Because Wyatt Emerson, reckless, wild-hearted Wyatt Emerson, looked directly into her eyes and spoke with such simple honesty that half the church began crying again. "I spent a long time wandering through life thinking nothing could really hold me," he said quietly. "Then I met you." Charlotte's breath trembled. "You make me better, Charlotte. Braver, too." His smile softened. "Though don't tell anybody I admitted that." Gentle laughter rippled through the church. Wyatt squeezed her hands carefully. "I promise I'll love you loud. Every day. For the rest of my life." Charlotte's eyes overflowed instantly. When her turn came, her voice shook. "You taught me life was meant to be lived fully," she whispered, "not simply endured quietly." Wyatt's expression nearly broke her heart. "I thought coming west meant losing everything familiar," Charlotte continued softly. "But somehow it led me to exactly where I belonged." Tears glimmered openly in Wyatt's eyes now, and Charlotte loved him so fiercely in that moment she thought her chest might burst from it. Then finally, "By the authority vested in me." The church held its breath. "You may kiss your bride." Wyatt kissed her before the minister finished speaking. The entire church erupted, laughing and cheering immediately. Charlotte laughed helplessly against his mouth while Wyatt held her close like he never intended letting go again, which, she suspected happily, he probably didn't. The reception beside the creek lasted until nearly midnight. Lanterns glowed from the cottonwood trees while fiddlers played lively music beneath the stars. Long tables overflowed with food. Children raced through the grass. Cowboys danced badly. Mrs. Bell cried openly every 20 minutes. And Charlotte danced beneath lantern light in Wyatt Emerson's arms while spring wind moved softly through the valley around them. "You're my wife," Wyatt murmured for perhaps the 100th time. "Yes." "You sure?" Charlotte laughed. "Reasonably." "Good." He spun her gently across the grass while music swelled warmly around them. Nearby, Clara Finch shouted, "Kiss her again." Wyatt grinned wickedly. "Thought you'd never ask." Charlotte laughed as he pulled her close once more. The stars stretched endlessly above them. Music drifted through the warm Montana night. The whole town celebrated around them. And for the first time in her life, Charlotte Woodrow no longer felt like someone standing quietly at the edge of life watching it happen to other people. Now she was living it, fully, wildly, beautifully, and Wyatt Emerson was smiling at her like the luckiest man alive. Married life suited Wyatt Emerson alarmingly well. Charlotte discovered this almost immediately, not because he became calmer. That absolutely did not happen. 3 days after the wedding, Wyatt attempted to repair a loose shutter by climbing onto the ranch house roof during high wind while balancing a hammer between his teeth. Charlotte stepped outside carrying laundry just in time to see him nearly lose his footing. "Wyatt," he looked down cheerfully from the roof. "Morning, wife." Charlotte dropped the laundry basket directly into the dirt. "You are going to break your neck." "I'm fine." At that exact moment, a roof shingle snapped loudly beneath his boot. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. "This," she informed the heavens, "is my life now." Wyatt laughed so hard he nearly slid off the roof entirely, which did not improve matters. The ranch house itself sat in a broad valley north of Bitter Creek, where cottonwoods lined a winding creek and open fields stretched toward the mountain. It was not grand, but it was theirs. The first morning Charlotte woke there as Mrs. Emerson. Sunlight spilled warm across handmade quilts, while Wyoming meadowlarks sang outside the window. For a few peaceful moments she simply lay there listening to the quiet breathing beside her. Wyatt slept sprawled half across the bed as though personally fighting the mattress for territory. One arm rested heavily around her waist. Charlotte smiled softly. The notorious Wyatt Emerson, terror of saloons, breaker of fences, destroyer of respectable peace. And somehow, impossibly, hers. As if sensing her thoughts, Wyatt opened one eye slightly. "You smiling at me again?" Charlotte laughed quietly. "Perhaps. New marriage would improve your judgment. It has not improved yours." Wyatt pulled her closer immediately. "Too late now. You're legally attached to the nonsense." Charlotte buried her face against his shoulder, laughing softly while morning sunlight filled the room around them. And just like that, the ranch began to feel like home. The first months of marriage became a strange and beautiful mixture of romance and absolute chaos. Charlotte learned quickly that ranch life possessed very little dignity, particularly when chickens were involved. "Why are they chasing me?" she cried one afternoon while sprinting across the yard pursued by 6 furious hens. Wyatt leaned against the corral fence laughing helplessly. "You've got feed in your apron pocket. How does that help me now?" One chicken launched itself directly at Charlotte's skirt. Charlotte shrieked scandalously. Wyatt nearly collapsed laughing. Later that evening, Charlotte informed him coldly, "You failed to protect your bride." Wyatt kissed her smiling mouth immediately. My bride looked terrifyingly capable. Charlotte attempted to remain offended. She failed around the third kiss. Despite the chaos, they were happy, wildly happy. The kind of happiness Charlotte once believed only existed in novels written by unrealistic women with poor judgment. Yet here she was, laughing more than she ever had in her life, arguing with her husband while baking bread, riding beside him across golden fields beneath endless sky, falling asleep every night tucked safely against the warm, solid certainty of Wyatt Emerson. And Wyatt adored married life with alarming intensity. He touched Charlotte constantly now, a hand at her waist, fingers brushing hers, quick kisses stolen while she cooked, his forehead against hers before leaving for town, as though he still could not quite believe she was real. One evening, Charlotte looked up from peeling apples to find Wyatt simply watching her from across the kitchen. "What? You're pretty." Charlotte rolled her eyes fondly. "That is hardly new information." "No," Wyatt agreed softly. "Still distracts me, though." Charlotte's heart fluttered warmly, even now, especially now, because Wyatt never loved her quietly. He loved her openly, joyfully, without restraint. And after a lifetime spent trying not to take up too much space in the world, Charlotte found being loved that way healed something deep inside her. Of course, not every adjustment came easily. Charlotte's first attempt at ranch cooking nearly poisoned Wyatt. "I think the potatoes are still hard," she said uncertainly. Wyatt attempted chewing heroically. "Might break a tooth," Charlotte gasped. "Why would you say that while eating them?" "Wanted to support your confidence." "You're impossible." Wyatt swallowed with visible effort. "Still your husband." Charlotte burst into helpless laughter. Eventually she improved, mostly. Though Mrs. Bell later claimed Wyatt would have survived even if Charlotte served roofing nails for supper because "that fool man looks at her like sunshine personally learned to cook biscuits." By autumn, Charlotte had become something Bitter Creek found endlessly entertaining. A refined Eastern schoolteacher attempting ranch life with fierce determination and deeply inconsistent results. The townspeople adored her, especially after the incident with the cow. Charlotte preferred not to discuss the incident with the cow. Unfortunately, Wyatt discussed it constantly. "You screamed before the cow even moved. It was large. It was eating grass. It looked judgmental." Wyatt laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. Charlotte crossed her arm. "I was trying to help. You climbed onto the fence backwards. I panicked. You absolutely panicked." Charlotte tried to maintain dignity. This became difficult when Wyatt suddenly caught her around the waist and kissed her cheek. "My brave little ranch wife." Charlotte laughed despite herself, because beneath all the teasing, Wyatt looked genuinely proud of her. Always. Every new thing she tried, every fear she pushed through, every piece of Montana she claimed as her own. He saw all of it and loved her harder for it. That winter brought heavy snow to the valley. Storms buried the ranch in white drifts while icy wind rattled the windows at night. Charlotte discovered she loved winter evenings best. The quiet, the firelight, the warmth of home after bitter cold outside. One stormy night she sat reading beside the fireplace while Wyatt repaired harness leather nearby. Snow hammered softly against the windows. The ranch house glowed warm and golden around them. Charlotte lowered her book slowly. "What?" Wyatt glanced up. You've been staring at me for several minutes." "Correct." "Why?" Wyatt considered thoughtfully. "Married you." "Yes." "Still seems suspiciously lucky." Charlotte smiled softly. "You are absurdly romantic for a man who once threatened someone with a shovel. He insulted your pie." "It was not my best pie. Didn't matter." Charlotte laughed quietly. Then Wyatt set aside the harness and crossed toward her. The firelight flickered warm across his face as he crouched beside her chair. "You happy?" he asked softly. The question startled her slightly, not because she lacked an answer, because she had never imagined happiness could feel this complete. Charlotte touched his cheek gently. "Yes." Wyatt's expression softened completely. "Good." Charlotte looked around the little ranch house. Boots drying near the fire, snow gathering outside, her husband kneeling beside her with love written openly across his face. Then she remembered the frightened woman arriving in Bitter Creek months ago with muddy skirts and careful manners and a heart too afraid to want anything fully. That woman felt very far away now. Charlotte smiled softly and brushed her fingers through Wyatt's hair. "You know," she murmured, "I think Montana ruined me." Wyatt grinned slowly. "Sweetheart," he said warmly, "Montana finally let you loose." And then he kissed her while snow fell softly outside and the whole wild, beautiful territory stretched endless around the life they were building together. Spring returned to the Emerson ranch in an explosion of color. Wildflowers spread across the valley in waves of blue, gold, and violet while snowmelt swelled the creek behind the house. The air smelled of damp earth and sunshine, and every breeze carried birdsong through the cottonwood. Charlotte loved spring on the ranch, though perhaps not quite as much as Wyatt loved spring on the ranch, mostly because spring apparently convinced him he was immortal. Wyatt Emerson. Charlotte stood on the porch in absolute outrage while her husband attempted to balance atop a fence post holding a hammer in one hand and nails between his teeth. Wyatt glanced toward her cheerfully. "Morning, sweetheart. You are going to fall." "I'm fine." The fence promptly cracked beneath him. Wyatt disappeared completely. Charlotte gasped. Then came muffled swearing from the grass. Charlotte marched toward the collapsed section of fence with terrifying calm. "You realize," she informed him while he untangled himself from broken boards, "that respectable women are not meant to spend this much time wondering whether their husbands are alive." Wyatt grinned up at her from the dirt. "But you'd miss me." Charlotte tried not to smile. She failed immediately. Wyatt looked unbearably pleased with himself. "You're getting softer on me, Mrs. Emerson. You are concussed." "Probably." Charlotte offered him a hand despite herself. Wyatt took it and pulled her laughing down into the grass beside him. "Wyatt." He wrapped both arms around her before she could properly protest. Warm sunlight spilled over the valley around them while meadowlarks sang nearby. Charlotte laughed breathlessly as Wyatt buried his face against her neck. "You smell nice." "I smell like flower." Wife smell." Charlotte shook her head fondly. "You are impossible." "Still your favorite impossible person, though." Unfortunately, that was entirely true. A week later, Charlotte discovered she was pregnant. The realization arrived quietly. Then all at once, she stood alone in the ranch kitchen staring blankly at absolutely nothing while her entire world rearranged itself inside her chest. A baby. Her hand drifted slowly to her stomach. Oh heavens! Charlotte sat down immediately. Outside the kitchen window, she could see Wyatt repairing the corral gate shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows while sunlight flashed warm against his hair. A father. The thought struck her with such sudden tenderness her eyes filled instantly. Wyatt would be wonderful. Reckless, undoubtedly. Chaotic, certainly. But wonderful. Because beneath all the teasing and laughter and impossible charm, Wyatt Emerson loved with his whole heart. Charlotte knew that better than anyone alive. The kitchen door burst open. "There you are," Wyatt announced. "I've been looking everywhere." Then he stopped. Charlotte looked up slowly. Wyatt's expression changed immediately. "What's wrong?" Charlotte laughed shakily through sudden tears. "Nothing." "Charlotte." He crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides and crouched beside her chair instantly. "What happened?" Charlotte stared at him. At the concern in his eyes, the warmth, the love, and suddenly she could hardly speak around the emotion swelling inside her chest. Wyatt reached for her hands gently. "Sweetheart, you're scaring me." Charlotte laughed again helplessly, then whispered, "We're having a baby." Silence. Complete silence. Wyatt blinked once. Then again, Charlotte watched realization strike him in stages. Confusion, shock, wonder. Then joy exploded across his face so suddenly and completely it stole her breath. "A baby?" Charlotte nodded tearfully. Wyatt looked moments from either laughing, crying, or setting the house on fire accidentally. "A real baby?" Charlotte burst into laughter. "No, Wyatt, a decorative one." He barked out a startled laugh and immediately pulled her into his arms. Charlotte clung to him tightly while Wyatt held her like something precious enough to break him open entirely. "We're having a baby," he repeated softly against her hair. Charlotte could hear the awe in his voice, and suddenly she began crying in earnest. which alarmed Wyatt immediately. "Oh no, are these happy tears?" "Yes." "You sure?" "Yes. You're crying a lot lately." "I am emotional." "You're adorable." Charlotte laughed tearfully against his shoulder. Then Wyatt leaned back just enough to look at her. His eyes shone openly now. "My God," he whispered softly, "you're going to be the prettiest mother in Montana." Charlotte's heart melted completely. Then Wyatt grinned suddenly. "Our kid's probably going to be terrifying, though." Charlotte stared at him. "Why?" "Combination of us." Unfortunately, he had a point. News traveled through Bitter Creek at the speed of gossip and coffee. By the following afternoon, the entire town knew. Charlotte had never seen so many pies appear at one residence in her life. Mrs. Bell cried openly. Mrs. Mercer brought blankets. Clara Finch announced dramatically that Charlotte's child would either become governor or rob banks. Wyatt looked offended. "Why not both?" Charlotte smacked his arm immediately. "You are not encouraging outlaw behavior before the child exists." Wyatt leaned down and whispered near her ear. "Little late marrying me for that, sweetheart." Charlotte failed to suppress a laugh. Across the room, Mrs. Bell pointed dramatically. "There. That right there. The baby's gonna come out sarcastic." Pregnancy suited Charlotte in ways she had not expected. She softened slightly, laughed more, cried at truly unreasonable things. One afternoon she burst into tears because Wyatt carved a tiny wooden horse for the baby. "It has little ears," she sobbed. Wyatt looked deeply alarmed, holding the carving. "Is that bad?" "No," Charlotte cried harder. "That's the problem." Wyatt glanced helplessly toward Mrs. Bell. "She's broken." Mrs. Bell smacked the back of his head. "You did this to her." Meanwhile, Wyatt became unbearably protective. "You cannot climb on chairs anymore. I was reaching a jar. You could fall." "Wyatt, you nearly tripped yesterday. I stepped on your boot." "Dangerous boot." Charlotte laughed helplessly. He hovered constantly now, guiding her over muddy ground, bringing extra blankets, checking whether she was tired every 20 minutes. One evening, Charlotte caught him staring at her stomach with open amazement while she folded laundry. "What?" Wyatt shook his head slowly. "There's a little person in there." "Yes." "A tiny one." "Yes, Wyatt." "That's incredible." Charlotte smiled softly. Then Wyatt crouched carefully in front of her and rested one hand gently over her stomach. The gesture held such quiet wonder that Charlotte's throat tightened. "You know," he murmured thoughtfully, "this kid's already got your stubbornness." Charlotte lifted a brow. "Why?" "Because it picked you to live inside, had options, and still chose violence." Charlotte laughed so hard she nearly dropped the laundry basket. Wyatt grinned up at her. Then his expression softened completely. "You happy, Charlotte?" The question wrapped warmly around her heart because Wyatt still asked it often, as though her happiness mattered to him as much as breathing. Charlotte touched his cheek gently. Yes, and she was. Wildly. Not because life had become perfect. The ranch remained chaotic. Wyatt remained reckless. Chickens still behaved like criminals. But happiness no longer felt like something distant reserved for other people. Now it lived here, in sunlit kitchens, in Wyatt's laughter, in tiny carved wooden horses, in warm Montana evenings beneath endless skies. And as Wyatt kissed her gently beneath the soft golden light of spring, Charlotte thought perhaps life had not ruined her at all. Perhaps it had finally led her exactly where she was meant to be. Charlotte decided almost immediately that childbirth was a terrible invention. "This," she informed Wyatt through clenched teeth, "is entirely your fault." Wyatt, who had spent the last 3 hours hovering in a state somewhere between panic and worship, nodded instantly. "Absolutely." Another pain seized Charlotte. She gripped his hand hard enough to threaten permanent injury. Wyatt did not even flinch. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley while rain battered the ranch house roof. Summer storms had settled over Bitter Creek all evening, turning the windows silver with water and filling the air with electricity. Mrs. Bell bustled around the bedroom with terrifying efficiency while the town doctor muttered reassurances Charlotte no longer believed. Wyatt remained beside the bed, refusing to leave even briefly. "You should sit down," Charlotte gasped at one point. Wyatt looked personally offended. "You're doing all the hard work." "Yes," Charlotte snapped. And you look moments from fainting." "I do not faint." Mrs. Bell snorted loudly from across the room. "Men faint constantly. I ain't fainting." At that exact moment, Wyatt went slightly pale. Charlotte would have laughed if she had not been occupied attempting to survive. Hours later, just before dawn, the storm finally broke. Not outside. Inside the room, a tiny cry suddenly filled the ranch house. Sharp, indignant, alive. Everything stopped. Charlotte fell back against the pillows, trembling with exhaustion, while the doctor laughed softly. "Well now," he said warmly, "there's your daughter." Daughter. Charlotte's eyes filled instantly. Mrs. Bell wrapped the tiny, squirming infant carefully in blankets before placing her gently into Charlotte's arm. Oh heavens! Charlotte stared down in absolute wonder. The baby had a furious little face, a shocking amount of dark hair, and tiny fists already clenched with determination. "She looks mad," Wyatt whispered reverently beside the bed. Mrs. Bell wiped her eyes. "She's an Emerson already." Charlotte laughed weakly through tears. Wyatt stood utterly motionless, staring at the baby like someone had handed him a miracle too precious to touch. Charlotte looked up at him softly. "Wyatt." He blinked rapidly, then very carefully sat beside her on the bed. Charlotte placed the baby gently into his arm. The transformation in Wyatt Emerson's face nearly shattered her heart completely. Every reckless edge softened at once. Wonder overtook him entirely. The notorious Wyatt Emerson, saloon fighter, troublemaker, impossible cowboy, looked down at his daughter with tears openly shining in his eyes. "Well," he whispered roughly, "there you are." The baby yawned dramatically. Wyatt immediately looked devastated with love. Charlotte leaned against his shoulder, exhausted and happy beyond words. "She's beautiful," Wyatt murmured. Charlotte smiled faintly. "You said that before seeing her properly." "Didn't matter." The baby made a tiny grunting noise. Wyatt's expression somehow softened further. "Oh no," he whispered. "I'm ruined." Mrs. Bell laughed outright. "Told you." Wyatt looked at Charlotte helplessly. "I love her already." Charlotte rested her head gently against him. "I know." And she did. Because Wyatt Emerson had always loved loudly, completely, without reservation. Now all that fierce, impossible love had somewhere new to go. They named her Eleanor Grace Emerson, though Wyatt immediately began calling her Ellie before the ink dried on the Bible record. "She's too little for Eleanor." "That is not how names function," Charlotte informed him tiredly. Wyatt kissed her forehead absently while rocking the baby. "Ellie," he repeated confidently. The baby sneezed. Wyatt looked enchanted. Charlotte watched them both from the bed with overwhelming tenderness swelling inside her chest. This was the life she once could not even imagine wanting because it would have hurt too much to hope for it. Now it existed around her in warm morning light. Her husband holding their daughter, rain soft against the windows, the mountains beyond the valley washed silver after the storm. Home. Bitter Creek lost its collective mind over the baby. By noon, the ranch house overflowed with visitors, pies, flowers, blankets, and entirely too much advice. Mrs. Mercer cried. Sheriff Collins declared Ellie the prettiest little outlaw in Montana. Charlotte objected strongly to the word outlaw. Wyatt looked proud. Earl Jenkins stared at the baby solemnly. "She's got Wyatt's eyes." Charlotte looked immediately alarmed. "Oh dear." Wyatt grinned. "Too late now." Clara Finch held Ellie once and announced dramatically, "That child is going to run this town someday." "Hopefully legally," Charlotte muttered. Fatherhood transformed Wyatt in fascinating ways. Not calmer, never calmer, but softer. Charlotte often woke during those first weeks to find Wyatt standing beside the cradle simply staring at Ellie with complete amazement. One night she opened her eyes near midnight to discover him whispering seriously to the sleeping baby. "You're not allowed to marry idiots," he informed her solemnly. Charlotte laughed sleepily from the bed. Wyatt looked over innocently. "Important conversation. She is 6 days old." "Exactly. Impressionable." Charlotte smiled into the pillow. Then Wyatt carefully lifted Ellie from the cradle and carried her toward the bed. "She likes hearing your voice." Charlotte reached for the baby automatically. Wyatt watched the two of them with such open devotion that her chest ached. "You know," he murmured softly, I used to think freedom meant never belonging anywhere. Charlotte looked up at him. Ellie yawned sleepily against her chest. Wyatt brushed one finger gently over the baby's tiny hand. "Turns out," he said quietly, "this is better." Charlotte's eyes filled instantly, because she knew how true those words were for him, for both of them. Summer deepened around the ranch. Days settled into beautiful chaos. Laundry flapping in warm wind, Wyatt carrying Ellie around tucked against his chest while attempting chores, Charlotte laughing from the porch as her husband spoke to the baby with complete seriousness about cattle prices. "She understands me. She is 3 months old. She's advanced." Ellie promptly spit milk down the front of his shirt. Charlotte laughed so hard she nearly dropped the basket she carried. Wyatt looked down at the baby in betrayal. That felt deliberate. Ellie blinked up at him peacefully. Charlotte kissed her daughter's soft forehead and smiled. The ranch house felt fuller now, warmer somehow. Tiny socks hung drying beside work shirts. Wooden toys appeared mysteriously everywhere. Baby laughter echoed through open windows beneath Montana sky. And Wyatt had become absolutely shameless. He bragged about Charlotte constantly now. "My wife made biscuits. My wife fixed the fence latch. My wife's prettier than everybody else's wife." Charlotte finally informed him one evening, "You cannot keep introducing me to strangers as the most beautiful woman in Montana." Wyatt looked genuinely confused. "Why not if it's true?" Charlotte buried her burning face against his shoulder while he laughed softly above her. Then Ellie, watching from Wyatt's lap, laughed too. The sound stilled both of them instantly. Tiny, bright, perfect. Wyatt stared at their daughter in awe. Charlotte felt tears threaten again. "You cry too much," Wyatt whispered fondly. "You made me emotional." "Worth it, though." Charlotte looked at her husband holding their laughing daughter beneath golden evening light, then out across the ranch stretching endless and beautiful beneath the summer sky. Once upon a time, Charlotte Woodrow had believed her life would be small, quiet, careful. Instead, she had found Montana, found laughter, found courage, found love wild enough to remake her completely. And as Wyatt pulled her close while Ellie giggled between them, Charlotte thought perhaps the best stories were the ones nobody sensible ever planned for. 5 years later, the Emerson Ranch had become louder than any place Charlotte Woodrow Emerson had ever imagined possible. This was largely the fault of the twin. "Samuel Wyatt Emerson," Charlotte shouted across the yard. "Put your brother down immediately." Little Samuel, age 4, muddy to the eyebrows, and possessed of entirely too much, Emerson's confidence froze halfway through, dragging his identical twin brother across the dirt by one boot. "We're playing ranch rescue," he explained solemnly. James, upside down in the dust, waved cheerfully. "I got bit by pretend wolves." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Across the yard, Wyatt leaned against the corral fence, laughing so hard he could barely remain standing. "You are not helping," Charlotte informed her husband. Wyatt wiped tears from his eyes. "Sweetheart, they got imagination. They tied the dog to a wagon yesterday." In fairness, the dog looked willing. The dog barked happily nearby as though agreeing. Charlotte pressed one hand dramatically to her forehead. "I used to be a dignified woman." Wyatt crossed the yard and kissed her temple lazily. "Yeah," he murmured warmly. "But you're happier now." The irritating thing was, he was right. Life on the Emerson Ranch had become beautiful chaos. Their daughter Eleanor Ellie, to everyone except Charlotte during moments of seriousness, was now 5 years old and alarmingly intelligent. She had Charlotte's eyes, Wyatt's grin, and the terrifying ability to manipulate nearly every adult in Bitter Creek. The twins, meanwhile, possessed enough combined energy to power a railroad, and Wyatt adored every second of it. "Boys," he called now across the yard, "who wants to help me break horses?" Charlotte turned sharply. "Absolutely not." Wyatt blinked innocently. "Educational activity. They are 4. Exactly. Prime horse age." Samuel gasped excitedly. James nearly fell over trying to run toward the barn faster. Charlotte pointed firmly at Wyatt. "If either child ends today hanging upside down from livestock, I shall bury you personally." Wyatt grinned slowly. "Love when you flirt." Charlotte stared at him in disbelief. After 7 years of marriage, The man remained impossible, hopelessly impossible, and somehow she loved him more every year. The ranch itself thrived now. What began as Wyatt's modest cattle operation had grown steadily into one of the most respected ranches near Bitter Creek. Not wealthy exactly, but solid. Good land, healthy cattle, strong horses, a home full of noise and warmth and laughter. Charlotte still taught part-time at the schoolhouse during winter months, though now she did so with one toddler occasionally attached to her skirts and another climbing furniture in the background. Her students found this delightful. Charlotte found it exhausting. One snowy afternoon, she arrived home to discover the twins had painted one of the chickens blue. Blue. Wyatt stood in the yard examining the bird thoughtfully while the boys looked deeply proud of themselves. "Why?" Charlotte asked faintly. Samuel shrugged. "She looked boring." James nodded. "Needed personality." Wyatt crossed his arms seriously. "Can't argue with artistic vision." Charlotte stared at all three Emerson males. Then, to her horror, she started laughing. Because what else could she do? The chicken strutted proudly through the yard, looking mildly offended but otherwise unharmed. Ellie appeared beside Charlotte, carrying a book almost as large as herself. "Papa says the chicken's Western now." Charlotte covered her face with one hand. Of course he did. That autumn, the Emerson family traveled into Bitter Creek for the Harvest Festival. The town square glowed with lanterns and ribbons while music drifted warmly through crisp evening air. Children raced through piles of leaves. Women sold preserves and pies. Ranchers gathered swapping stories near bonfires. Charlotte stood near the church booth adjusting James's suspenders while Samuel attempted to climb a wagon wheel nearby. Ellie tugged Charlotte's sleeve gently. "Mama?" "Yes, darling?" "Why are those ladies staring at Papa?" Charlotte followed her daughter's gaze. Sure enough, two younger women near the mercantile were openly admiring Wyatt as he laughed with Sheriff Collins. Even after all these years, women still looked at Wyatt Emerson. He had aged beautifully. Broader now, a little rougher around the edges, more laugh lines near his eyes. Still devastatingly handsome. Still entirely too charming. Charlotte lifted one brow slightly. "Well," she said calmly, "your father has always attracted attention." Ellie considered this thoughtfully. Then she announced loudly, "But he likes you best." Several nearby townspeople burst out laughing. Across the square, Wyatt looked up immediately at the sound. The moment he saw Charlotte, his entire expression changed exactly the way it always had. Softened, warmed, focused only on her. 7 years later, and the sight still fluttered through Charlotte's chest like sunlight. Wyatt crossed the square toward them through the crowd. The women watching him looked disappointed. Charlotte found this deeply satisfying. Wyatt scooped Ellie effortlessly into one arm while James attached himself to his leg, and Samuel demanded to know whether explosions existed. "Probably," Wyatt answered. Charlotte sighed. "Please stop teaching them questionable things." Wyatt kissed her quickly before she could continue. Too late. The twins shouted simultaneously about pie. Wyatt immediately led them toward the dessert tables like a reckless frontier Pied Piper. Charlotte followed more slowly, laughing softly beneath her breath. Mrs. Bell appeared beside her carrying cider. "You know," the older woman said warmly, "he still looks at you like you hung the moon." Charlotte smiled helplessly. "I know." And she did. Every single day. Later that evening, after the festival quieted and the children finally collapsed asleep in a tangled heap at home, Charlotte stepped onto the porch wrapped in a shawl. The Montana night stretched vast and silver around the ranch. Inside, soft firelight glowed through the windows. Wyatt joined her moments later carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You escaped." "Barely." Wyatt laughed softly and handed her a mug. For a while they sat together quietly listening to crickets and distant wind through the cottonwoods. Then Wyatt glanced toward the house fondly. "You realize our sons are completely feral." Charlotte smiled into her coffee. "They learned from your side of the family." "Fair. And Ellie is already smarter than both of us combined." "That part's definitely from you." Charlotte leaned lightly against his shoulder. Years ago she would have thought this life impossible. Too loud. Too messy. Too full. Now she could not imagine wanting anything else. "You happy?" Wyatt asked softly. He still asked her that. After all these years, Charlotte looked out across the ranch. The barn silhouetted beneath moonlight, the endless Montana sky, the warm home behind them filled with sleeping children. Then she looked at Wyatt Emerson beside her, the reckless cowboy who once pulled her trunk from the mud and somehow changed her whole life in the process. Charlotte smiled softly. Yes. Wyatt kissed the top of her head. Good. Then his grin turned mischievous. You know what I was thinking? Charlotte immediately looked suspicious. That expression concerns me. We should buy more horses. Charlotte stared at him in horror. Absolutely not. Wyatt looked delighted already, and Charlotte realized with helpless affection that some things would never change. Thank heavens for that.